Clara Whitmore had written his name 312 times on paper. No one ever answered. On the night she finally let go of her hope, a man in a captain's coat walked through the door, and every candle in the room seemed to bend toward him. He was supposed to be dead. He wasn't. And the reason he'd stayed silent for 6 years would break her heart before it healed it. Before we start, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss a single letter of what happens next. Now, let's go back to the night Virginia stopped breathing. The room had already forgotten her. That was how Clara Whitmore preferred it. She stood near the far wall of Caldwell Manor's great hall, a glass of unsweetened punch warming in her hand, watching the daughters of Virginia's finest families turn slow circles beneath the candlelight. Nobody asked her to dance. Nobody expected her to. She had learned over 6 years of these harvest gatherings exactly how much space a poor relation was permitted to take up in a rich man's house, and she had learned to take up less than that. Her Aunt Margaret had told her before they left the carriage, "Smile, Clara, just smile. It cost you nothing, and it embarrasses no one." Clara had smiled. She was still smiling now, though it had gone stiff at the corners an hour ago. She was not thinking about the letters. She told herself that every year on this night, and every year it was a lie. 312 of them. She had stopped counting out loud sometime around year 4, when saying the number out loud had started to feel like grief dressed up as arithmetic. She still knew it exactly. 312 letters written to a man the United States Army had confirmed dead in a supply skirmish along the frontier 6 summers past. 312 letters she had folded, sealed, and never once sent, because there was no address left to send them to, only a name on a list of the fallen. She had kept every single one in a cedar box beneath her bed. The talk around her rose and fell in familiar shapes. Crop yields, a Richmond wedding. Whether Thomas Caldwell might finally take a wife before he turned 50, and there was no one left to leave the land to. Clara had stopped listening to most of it years ago. She had trained her ears the way a person trains themselves not to flinch at a loud noise, not because the noise stopped hurting, but because flinching gave people something to talk about. Then the room changed. She felt it before she understood it, the way you feel weather shift before the sky tells you why. The music didn't stop, not exactly, but the fiddler's bow caught on a note and dragged. Conversations near the entrance thinned into silence and didn't pick back up. Clara turned more out of habit than curiosity, expecting to see some minor scandal, a spilled drink, a lady's torn hem. Instead, she saw him. He stood just inside the doorway, and for one full breath, Clara's mind simply refused the information her eyes were sending it. A man in a captain's coat, worn soft at the elbows boots, that had clearly walked further than any Virginia road required. His face was older than she remembered, leaner, weathered along the jaw, a thin pale scar cutting through one eyebrow that hadn't been there before. But the eyes. She would have known those eyes in a crowd of 1,000 men in the dark, at the bottom of a well. Captain William Harrison, reported dead in the autumn of 1811. Standing in Thomas Caldwell's great hall, as though 6 years were nothing more than a long walk home. Clara's glass slipped from her fingers. She didn't hear it shatter. She didn't feel the punch splash cold across her hem. The whole room had gone underwater, thick and slow, and the only thing moving at its proper speed was William Harrison's gaze sweeping the crowd, searching until it found her. He went still. Every conversation in the hall had died by now. 60-70 people, and not one of them breathed loud enough to be heard. Clara understood distantly that she should say something, do something, that a woman was supposed to have a response prepared for the day a dead man walked back into her life. She had none. 6 years of imagined reunions, and in every single one of them she had been graceful. She was not graceful now. She took one step forward on legs that did not feel entirely her own, and stopped an arm's length from him, close enough to see that the scar through his eyebrow had healed, jagged close enough to see that his hands, those same hands that had once helped her down from a fence rail on her family's old property, were shaking very slightly at his sides. "You're dead," she said. It came out flat, almost accusing, because some part of her was furious at him for making her a fool in front of every family in the county. I reckon a lot of folks would agree with you, ma'am, William said quietly. I was told the same thing myself more than once. Don't, Clara said, and her voice cracked clean down the middle. Don't you dare call me ma'am. Not you. Not after... She stopped. Her throat had closed around 6 years of words, and wouldn't let a single one of them out whole. Behind her, she heard her aunt's sharp intake of breath, heard the whisper start to spread through the hall like fire finding dry grass. Harrison. That's Harrison. The one who died out west. Whitmore's girl wrote to him for years. Didn't she? God rest her foolish heart. Clara didn't turn to look at them. She kept her eyes on William, on the too careful stillness of a man holding something back with both hands. 312 letters, she said. I wrote you 312 letters, William. I sat at my window every winter and wrote to a grave. And you're telling me you were alive. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like pain finding a familiar home. I know how that number sounds coming out of your mouth, he said. I know it, because I counted the ones I never got to answer to. Then why? Her voice broke again, and this time she let it. 6 years of composure of smiling, because it cost her nothing of being the quiet poor relation who took up no space. All of it cracked open in front of 70 witnesses, and she found she did not care. Why didn't you write back? One line, William. One single line telling me you were breathing would have been enough. Why did you let me bury you? William's jaw worked twice before the answer came, and when it did, it came low and rough, meant only for her, though the whole silent room heard it anyway. Because if I'd answered you, Clara, he said, you'd have been the one they buried instead. What? For a long moment, nobody in Caldwell Manor moved. Clara felt the words land somewhere beneath her ribs and stay there heavy and strange, refusing to make sense, no matter how many times she turned them over. You'd have been the one they buried instead. It sounded like something out of a penny dreadful, not something a man said to a woman across a crowded ballroom on a warm September night. That's not an answer, she said finally, though it came out smaller than she intended. That's a riddle. It's the truth, William said. I'll give you the whole of it. I owe you that much and more, but not here. His eyes flicked just once toward the crowd pressing closer around them, and Clara saw something tighten in his face. Not embarrassment, she realized. Wariness. The look of a man checking a room for a threat before he let his guard down even an inch. It was that look more than anything he'd said that told her he wasn't lying. Well, I never... came a voice from the edge of the crowd, warm and rich and entirely too pleased with itself. Captain Harrison, alive and well and gracing my humble gathering. If this isn't the Lord's own theater, I don't know what is. The crowd parted the way crowds always did for money, and Thomas Caldwell stepped through it with a smile stretched wide across his face and something considerably less warm sitting behind his eyes. He was a tall man, silver threading through dark hair at the temples, dressed finer than anyone else in the hall, because it was, after all, his hall. He clapped a hand on William's shoulder with the easy familiarity of an old friend, though Clara had never once heard William speak the man's name with any warmth in 6 years of correspondence. Cousin, Thomas said, and Clara caught the flicker of surprise that crossed several faces nearby. She hadn't ever been told that William and Thomas Caldwell shared blood. We buried an empty coffin for you 2 summers running. Had a stone carved and everything. Fine bit of granite wasted now, I suppose. He laughed, and a few uncertain guests laughed with him, though it died quickly in the thick air. Wasn't my idea to be declared dead, Thomas? William said. His voice had gone very even, very careful. Wasn't my idea to stay quiet about it either, but here I am. Here you are. Thomas agreed, and his hand tightened just slightly on William's shoulder before he let go. Alive. Well, and not a word sent to your own family in 6 years. Your mother wept herself sick over you, William. Did you know that wept herself into an early grave, some might say, waiting on a son who never once wrote? Clara watched William's face go pale beneath the weathered tan, watched something break loose in him that hadn't broken in front of her. My mother's dead. 3 years this spring, Thomas said. And there was no gentleness in the way he said it, only a kind of satisfaction dressed up as sympathy. I saw to the arrangements myself. Somebody had to, seeing as her only son was 6 years silent and presumed rotting in some frontier ditch. Clara stepped forward before she could think better of it, close enough that she stood almost between the two men. That's enough, she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake this time. The captain has been home exactly 4 minutes, Mr. Caldwell. I think he's owed a moment to breathe before you finish burying the rest of his family in front of a crowd. A ripple went through the onlookers, scandalized, delighted the particular hunger of people who had come for harvest punch and found themselves witnessing something far better. Thomas Caldwell turned his smile on Clara, and for the first time that night, it did not reach anywhere near his eyes. Miss Whitmore, he said, still keeping vigil, I see. 6 years of letters to a dead man, and now you'll defend him against his own cousin in my own home. Devotion like that ought to be admired, or pitied. I confess I've never been able to decide which. Then it's fortunate my opinion of you doesn't require your decision, Clara said. Somewhere behind her, she heard her aunt make a small strangled sound that was half horror and half something that might in a different life have been pride. Thomas's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than was polite, sharp and assessing in a way that made the fine hairs along Clara's arms rise before he smoothed his expression back into easy hospitality and turned to the wider room. Well, he called out, raising his voice. It isn't every night a dead man walks back into Virginia. I say we drink to it. Fetch the good brandy. My cousin's earned a proper welcome home, whatever the details of his absence. The crowd stirred into motion again, relieved to have permission to talk, to speculate, to turn the evening's shock into gossip they could carry home in their carriages. Music started up once more, thin and hesitant. But Clara did not move, and neither did William, and for a moment the two of them stood in the eye of the room's returning noise like the only still things in a river. He's lying about something, William said quietly, close enough that only she could hear it. About your mother? About all of it. His eyes tracked Thomas's retreating back with an expression Clara had never once seen on him in the 2 years they'd known each other before he left. Not in his letters, not in the soft, hopeful boy who had promised to come back for her. This was something colder, something that had survived 6 years, learning exactly how far a man could be pushed before he broke and had decided not to break. William? Clara said his name like a question, like a hand reaching into dark water. What happened to you? He looked at her, then really looked the way he used to look at her across her family's old porch on summer evenings before everything went wrong. Not here, he said again, gentler this time. Is there somewhere in this house a man could speak plainly without half of Virginia listening in? Margaret Whitmore did not want to let them go off alone together. 6 years of propriety did not simply evaporate because a man had returned from the dead, but there was something in her niece's face that night that made her hold her tongue longer than she otherwise might have. She settled finally on the library, with the door left open, a scandalous 3 inches, and herself stationed in the hall outside it, close enough to hear raised voices, far enough to pretend she couldn't hear ordinary ones. Inside, Clara sat on the edge of a low chair, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. William stood near the cold hearth, turning his hat over and over in his hands, like a man who had forgotten what to do with them when they weren't holding a rifle. Start at the beginning, Clara said. I've waited 6 years, William. I can wait a few more minutes for the truth, but I won't wait one more day past tonight. William nodded slowly. You remember the mission I told you about? Before I stopped writing. You said you were being sent west. Escort duty for a supply column, you said. You said you'd be back within the year. She heard her own voice thinning as she spoke, the old hurt rising up fresh, as if no time had passed at all. You said you loved me, and you'd write every chance you got. I meant every word of it, William said, and something in his voice cracked. The escort duty was real. What happened after wasn't in any of the letters I sent you because I didn't know it myself yet. We were ambushed 11 days out, not by anyone the army was expecting. Men working for someone with money and reasons of their own, dressed up to look like frontier raiders, so nobody official would go looking too hard. Clara's breath caught. Someone attacked a United States Army column and made it look like William. That's not a skirmish. That's a conspiracy. That's exactly what it was, William said grimly. Half my company killed outright. The rest of us taken marched somewhere so far off the map I still couldn't tell you rightly where it was. I spent the better part of 2 years in a camp that didn't exist on any army record. Clara being asked questions by men who knew things about troop movements they had no earthly business knowing. They thought you had information. They thought wrong mostly. I was a captain of an escort detail, not some general with maps in his head. But it didn't stop them asking. And somewhere in the second year, one of the men holding me found out I had a woman back in Virginia, writing to me faithful as sunrise. Found the letters they'd taken off me after the ambush. Read every one of them out loud to me just to watch my face while they did it. Clara felt something cold slide down the back of her neck. They read my letters. Everyone? William said, and his voice had gone rough. And then they told me plain, keep quiet, keep still, do exactly as told, or they'd see to it. The pretty girl writing all those letters had an accident. Wouldn't even need to send a man all the way to Virginia to do it. Said they had eyes closer to home than I'd like to think. He set the hat down finally, both hands flat against the mantel, as though he needed it to hold himself up. I couldn't write you a single word after that, Clara. Not one. Because the only thing standing between you and whatever they meant by accident was silence. Mine. So I gave it to them. 2 more years of it until I finally got free. The room had gone very quiet. Clara realized she was crying had been for some time. Likely, though she couldn't say when it started, and she did not bother wiping it away. You let me think you were dead, she said, to keep me alive. I let the whole world think it, William said. Wasn't only you. If word got out, I'd survived and come home talking about who'd truly held that camp and why well. I had a fair notion by the time I escaped that whoever set that ambush wasn't done with me yet. Coming home quiet, coming home slow, seemed the only way to have any chance of finding out who before they found out I was looking. And now you have found out. Something shuddered behind William's eyes, a door closing on a room he wasn't ready to show her yet. I've got a suspicion, he said carefully. Nothing I can prove. Not yet. William. Clara stood across the small distance between them, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion carved deep beneath his eyes, 6 years of it. Tell me. He looked at her a long moment, and she watched him weigh it, the same calculation she imagined he'd made 100 times in that camp. What to say and what to swallow to keep her safe. Finally, he spoke low enough that even the open door and her aunt's straining ears 3 inches beyond it couldn't have caught it. The men who held me knew things about my family's land holdings, he said. Things only someone close to the family would know. Boundary disputes, old surveys. The kind of detail a stranger wouldn't think to ask after even under threat. I've turned that fact over in my head more nights than I can count, Clara laying in the dark, wondering who'd stand to gain the most from a Harrison who never came home to claim what was his. Clara felt the pieces arranging themselves in her mind, even before William said the name, the way a half-finished puzzle suddenly reveals its picture. Your cousin manages your family's land, she said slowly. He told the whole haul he saw to your mother's affairs himself. He did, William said. Every acre of it near enough while I was presumed dead and unable to say otherwise. William. Clara's hand found his arm gripping tight. You think Thomas Caldwell had something to do with your ambush? I think, William said very quietly, that a man doesn't get rich off land that isn't his to sell without somebody a great deal more powerful than a frontier raiding party wanting the true owner gone a good long while. I can't prove it. Not tonight, not with what I've got. But I mean to. They did not have long to sit with the weight of it. A sharp rap sounded at the library door, and before either of them could compose themselves, Margaret Whitmore's voice came through tight with warning. Clara, Captain Harrison, Mr. Caldwell is asking for you both. I believe you'd best come now. Clara exchanged one look with William, a look that carried 6 years and a lifetime of unfinished business in it, before they returned to the hall together and found the mood of the room had shifted while they were gone. The music had stopped entirely. Guests had drawn into small murmuring clusters near the walls, the way people do when they sense a storm coming and want a clear path to the door. Thomas Caldwell stood near the center of the floor, a folded paper in one hand, his expression arranged into something that might have passed for regret to anyone who didn't know to look for the satisfaction underneath it. "Ah," he said as William and Clara approached. "There you are. I do apologize for interrupting whatever tender reunion the two of you were having, but I'm afraid a matter's come to my attention that can't rightly wait." "What matter?" William said. His voice had gone flat and careful again, the soldier's voice. "A serious one." Thomas held up the paper, though he did not offer it. "I took the liberty, cousin, of sending word to a friend of mine in the War Department the moment I laid eyes on you tonight. Wanted to be certain, for your own sake, understand that your return home was properly recorded, properly explained. Man can't simply walk out of 6 years of silence without some account of where he's been. And William's jaw had tightened. "And it seems," Thomas said, letting the pause stretch just long enough to draw every eye in the room, "there's no record at all of any ambush on your supply column. No captivity noted. No camp, no capture, nothing. Officially, Captain Harrison, you were listed dead in a routine skirmish case closed 6 years past. What I'm holding in my hand is a request from the department for a full accounting of your whereabouts these 6 years, and a rather pointed question as to why a man reported dead by his own commanding officer would choose silence over simply coming home unless he had something to hide." A murmur ran through the crowd, ugly and quick. Clara felt William go rigid beside her. "You're calling him a deserter," she said before William could answer for himself. "In front of 70 witnesses with a piece of paper you had drawn up yourself, not 2 hours after he walked through your door." "I'm calling nothing, Miss Whitmore," Thomas said smoothly. "I'm merely a concerned relation doing right by a family name that suffered enough scandal without adding desertion to the list. Though I'll grant you the timing does look rather convenient for him, doesn't it? Home just long enough to collect an inheritance he was presumed to have forfeited with no proof at all of where he's truly been." "I have proof," William said low and dangerous. "Scars on my back that'll tell you plain I wasn't drinking cider in some tavern these 6 years, Thomas. I have proof enough, and I mean to see it laid in front of the right people, in my own time, in my own way, not paraded out for your harvest party like a magic trick." "Then I do hope you find that time soon," Thomas said pleasantly, folding the paper back into his coat. "Because until you do, cousin, I'm afraid the law may take a rather dim view of a man who lets his own mother die grieving him rather than send one letter home. And I'd hate, truly, I would, to see the family name dragged through that particular mud on my watch." He smiled at William, and then lingering at Clara, and there was something in that second smile, brief, cold, gone as quickly as it came, that told Clara everything she needed to know, and nothing at all she could yet prove. Thomas Caldwell was not protecting the family name. He was making certain no one ever asked him why he needed William Harrison silent in the first place. Margaret Whitmore did not sleep that night, and neither, as far as Clara could tell through the thin wall between their rooms, did anyone else in the house. She lay awake until the candle guttered out on its own turning. William's words over and over, until they'd worn smooth as riverstone. A man doesn't get rich off land that isn't his to sell without somebody wanting the true owner gone a good long while. By the time the first gray light came through the curtains, she had stopped asking herself whether she believed him and started asking herself what she meant to do about it. She found her answer standing at the kitchen table before her aunt had even risen. Dressed and steady, waiting for the household to wake so she could tell them she was walking to town. "Absolutely not," Margaret said the moment she came downstairs and found Clara already in her bonnet. "Not after last night. Not with Thomas Caldwell looking at you the way he did." He was looking at William, Aunt Margaret. He was looking at both of you like a man deciding which board to pry up first. Margaret's hands, usually so steady over her needlework, trembled faintly as she poured the morning coffee. Clara, I have kept this roof over our heads for 6 years on Caldwell Charity. I know what that man's smile costs people who cross him. I have watched him ruin men for less than what happened in that hall last night. Then you understand why I can't simply sit here and drink coffee, Clara said, gentler than she felt. William didn't come home to a welcome. He came home to a threat with a bow tied on it. If nobody helps him prove where he's been, Thomas will have him branded a deserter inside the week, and then it won't matter what really happened out west. It'll be over before it starts. Margaret set the coffee pot down hard enough to rattle the saucers. And if Thomas decides the girl helping him is a problem too, what happens to you then? What happens to us, Clara, when the only reason we've had a roof at all these 6 years is that man's goodwill? It was the question Clara had been avoiding since she woke, and hearing it spoken aloud in her aunt's kitchen made her stomach turn over once hard. I don't know, she admitted. But I know what happens if I do nothing. I spent 6 years writing to a man I thought was dead. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life watching him hang for it instead. Margaret looked at her a long moment. Really looked the way she hadn't in years, as though seeing something in her niece she'd forgotten was there. Whatever she found in Clara's face made her exhale slowly and press 2 fingers to her temple. Take old Robert with you into town, she said finally. I won't have you walking alone. Not this week. It wasn't a blessing, but Clara had learned long ago to take what she could get. The road into town was quiet at that hour, mist still clinging low over the tobacco fields on either side, and Clara used the walk to arrange her thoughts, the way she arranged Caldwell's correspondence by importance, then by what needed doing first. William had told her in the last minutes before she'd left the manor the night before that there was a man he needed to find. A sergeant who'd been taken in the same ambush who'd escaped the camp alongside him 8 months before William finally made his own way out. A man named Silas Cobb, who by William's last knowledge had settled somewhere near town after his discharge, working with his hands the way soldiers did when the army had no more use for them, and the world hadn't decided what use it had for them either. She found William waiting exactly where he'd said he would be, outside the smithy at the edge of town, still in yesterday's coat, looking as though he hadn't slept any better than she had. You didn't have to come, he said when she reached him. I know, Clara said. I came anyway. Something in his face loosened just slightly at that, though he didn't say anything more about it. He nodded toward the smithy door, where the ring of hammer on iron carried out into the street steady as a heartbeat. Sergeant Cobb, William called out once they'd stepped inside, and the hammering stopped mid-swing. The man who turned around was broad through the shoulders, forearms roped with muscle, a burn scar running pale up one side of his neck. He looked at William for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he's afraid might not be real if he blinks. Well, I will be damned, Silas Cobb said softly. They told me you were dead twice over Captain. Once by the army, and once by half the fool rumors in this county. Reckon I've heard that a lot in the last 12 hours, William said, and for the first time since Clara had seen him again, something like a real smile touched his face. Silas set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his apron, and crossed the smithy floor in 3 long strides to grip William's hand and forearm, both hard enough that Clara saw William wince and not care. How long you been back? Since last night. And you're standing in my shop instead of resting up somewhere. Silas's eyes moved past William to Clara, taking her in with the quick, careful assessment of a man used to sizing up who could be trusted in a room. This the letter-writing girl you used to talk about, the one you said kept you sane. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite everything. Clara Whitmore, she said, offering her hand, which Silas shook with rather more gentleness than his size suggested. Ma'am, he said. Man talked about you more than he talked about getting home some nights. Wondered if you were even half as real as he made you sound. I'm afraid I write better than I make conversation, Clara said, and Silas laughed short and surprised before his face sobered again. You're here because of trouble, he said to William. It wasn't a question. I'm here because Thomas Caldwell is trying to hang a desertion charge on me before I've been home a full day. William said. And because I need someone besides myself to say out loud what happened to us out west before he finishes the job. Silas's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the open smithy door, then crossed and shut it, dropping the bar across before he turned back. I figured someone would come asking eventually, he said. Didn't figure it'd be you doing the asking, seeing as I thought you were still 6 feet under. Sit down, both of you. This ain't a short conversation, and I don't much care to have it standing where anyone walking past can hear. What Silas told them over the next half hour filled in gaps in William's own account that even William hadn't known were missing, because Silas had been held in a different section of the camp, had overheard different conversations through different walls, had spent his own captivity memorizing details, the way a drowning man memorizes the shape of the shore. They talked business around us like we weren't there half the time, Silas said. Figured a couple of half-starved soldiers weren't worth guarding their tongues for. I heard names, numbers, talk of land and surveys that didn't make a lick of sense to a man like me at the time, seeing as I don't own so much as a garden plot. What names? William said, low and urgent. Silas hesitated, and Clara saw the calculation cross his face, the same wariness she'd seen in William the night before, the instinct of a man deciding how much truth a room could safely hold. I heard Caldwell, he said finally. More than once. Not sure at the time if it meant you, Captain, or somebody else entire, seeing as I didn't know your kin's name back then. But I heard it said plain more than once in the mouth of the man who ran that camp. Heard him say something about a deal not closing till the Harrison matter was settled proper. Didn't understand a word of it then. Understand a fair sight more of it now. Hearing you say Caldwell's the one trying to bury you a second time, the room went very quiet. Clara felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the way it had the night before, when William first walked through Thomas's door. You're certain, William said. Certain it was Caldwell, not some other name that sounds close. Captain, I spent 2 years memorizing every word that came out of that man's mouth on account of it was the only entertainment I got, Silas said grimly. I ain't certain of much these days. I'm certain of that. William closed his eyes for a moment, and Clara watched something in him go very still and very cold. Not shock, she realized. Confirmation. The last piece sliding into a shape he'd already half built in his mind through 6 years of dark nights wondering. Will you say that in front of a magistrate? William asked, opening his eyes again. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked down at his own scarred hands, turning them over as though checking they were still attached to him. Man like Thomas Caldwell's got money enough to make a blacksmith's testimony disappear a dozen ways that don't involve a courtroom, he said quietly. You're asking me to paint a target on my back for a man I ain't seen in 2 years. No offense meant by it. None taken, William said. I know what I'm asking. I'll think on it, Silas said. That's the honest answer I've got for you today, Captain. I ain't saying no. I ain't saying yes neither. Give me a day or two to figure how a man protects his family while doing the right thing, and I'll give you my answer. It wasn't the yes William had hoped for. But it wasn't a door closed either, and Clara watched him accept it the way a soldier accepts any ground gained, however small. They were nearly to the smithy door when Silas called William's name once more, something uneasy working across his broad face. One more thing, he said. Might be nothing. But there's been a man asking around town the last few days before you even showed up, mind asking after folks who used to serve with a Captain Harrison. Didn't give his own name. Paid good coin for information, and didn't much care who noticed him doing it. William went very still. Asking what exactly? Whether any of Harrison's old company were still living local. Whether any of us had ever talked about what happened out west. Silas's eyes were grim. I told him nothing for what it's worth. Didn't like the look of him. But Captain somebody's been hunting for loose ends around this story a good deal longer than you've been standing in my shop. Go. They walked back toward the manor road in silence for the first stretch, both of them turning that piece of information over like a coin neither wanted to be the one holding when it came up wrong. Someone's been watching for this, Clara said finally. Watching for you to come home. Or watching to see if any of your men would talk before you did. Or both, William said. Man asking after loose ends before I ever set foot back in Virginia, that ain't a coincidence, Clara. That's a man covering tracks he already knows are there. Thomas, Clara said. Or somebody working for him. Somebody who knew I was likely to turn up eventually and wanted to know who else might be able to back my account before I got the chance to gather them myself. William's hands had curled into fists at his sides without his seeming to notice. Which means, whatever's underneath this, Clara, whatever Thomas is protecting, it's bigger than one man's guilty conscience. Somebody's spent real money making sure the truth stayed buried out west with the rest of my company. Bisha. Clara thought of the ledgers she'd cataloged in Thomas Caldwell's study over the last 2 years, the endless columns of figures she'd copied out fair in her careful hand, because Thomas found her penmanship tidier than his own clerk's, because a poor relation with nowhere else to be was cheaper than hiring proper help, because nobody in that house had ever once considered that the quiet girl transcribing his correspondence might read what she was copying. I've been in that study more times than I can count, she said slowly, copying his letters, his accounts. I never thought twice about what any of it meant because none of it seemed to concern me. William stopped walking. Clara, I remember things, she said, meeting his eyes. I don't forget numbers, William, or names, or dates. My father used to say it was the only inheritance he managed to leave me since he certainly didn't leave me any money. A ghost of a smile crossed her face and faded just as quick. If there's something written down in that house that proves what you're saying about land, about a sale, about anything at all, there's a fair chance I've already had it under my own pen and simply didn't know what I was looking at. That's not the same as knowing what to look for now, William said, and there was real worry in his voice, not doubt. And it's not safe, Clara. If Thomas is capable of what Silas thinks he's capable of, a girl caught going through his private papers isn't going to get a stern word and a lecture. I know that. Do you? He turned to face her fully, something raw moving behind his eyes. I let 6 years pass without a word to keep you safe, Clara. I am not about to come home and watch you walk straight into the same danger I spent that whole time trying to keep you clear of. And I spent those same 6 years thinking you were dead, Clara said, and I still got up every single morning and kept writing anyway because sitting still and doing nothing never once felt like safety to me. It felt like drowning slow instead of fast. She held his gaze steady. I am not asking your permission, William. I'm telling you what I mean to do. There's a harvest ball at the Fairweather place in 4 days' time. Thomas will attend. He never misses a chance to be seen. His study will be empty that whole evening, same as it always is when the household turns out. I can be in and out inside 20 minutes, same as I've done 100 times copying his letters, except this time I'll know what I'm reading. William was quiet a long moment, jaw working clearly, hunting for an argument that would hold against the look on her face, and not finding one. 20 minutes, he said finally. I'll be close by the whole time. If anything goes sideways, then I'll have 100 excuses ready, same as always, Clara said. I've had 6 years' practice being invisible in that house, William. Let me finally put it to use. The 4 days that followed passed slower than any Clara could remember, each one thick with a tension that seemed to have settled permanently into the walls of her aunt's small house. Margaret watched her with an anxious, searching look that Clara pretended not to notice. William sent word twice through a boy from town, brief, careful notes. Nothing that would incriminate either of them, if intercepted, but enough to tell her that Silas Cobb had not yet given his answer, and that the man asking questions around town had not been seen again. On the 3rd day, a different sort of message arrived. It came in the form of Thomas Caldwell himself, appearing unannounced at the Whitmore door in the late afternoon, hat in hand. Smile fixed firmly in place, the very picture of a concerned neighbor come to call. Miss Whitmore, he said, when Clara answered the door herself, her aunt occupied in the garden. I do hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Mr. Caldwell, Clara said, keeping her voice as flat and pleasant as 6 years of practice allowed. Won't you come in? I think I'll say my piece right here, if it's all the same to you, Thomas said, and something in the way he said it made Clara's stomach tighten. Shan't take but a moment. He turned his hat over, once in his hands, an idle gesture that Clara suspected was not idle at all. "I've always had a great deal of respect for your aunt," he said. "For your whole family, truth be told. Difficult thing losing both parents so young, being taken in on charity, having to make your own way in a world that doesn't much care to make room for a woman without a fortune behind her. I've watched you manage it with more grace than most girls twice your circumstance." "You're very kind," Clara said, though the words tasted like ash. "I like to think so." Thomas's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold and watching. "Which is precisely why it troubles me to see you tangled up with my cousin's difficulties, Miss Whitmore. William's return as well. It's complicated, delicate, the sort of matter best handled by men with the standing to handle it properly. A young woman with no family fortune of her own, no husband, no protection beyond an aunt's good name. She stands to lose a great deal more than she has to gain, getting caught up in questions that aren't rightly hers to ask." "I wasn't aware I'd asked any questions, Mr. Caldwell." "Haven't you?" His voice stayed pleasant, gentle, even which made it worse. "I heard you spoke rather boldly on his behalf the other night. Heard, too, that you and he took a fair long walk together into town 2 days past. I make it my business to know a great many things, Miss Whitmore. It's how a man keeps a household and a family's good name from coming to ruin." Clara made herself hold his gaze, though every instinct told her to look away, to smile, to soften herself back into the shape he expected. "I was simply glad to see an old friend alive," she said. "I hardly think that constitutes tangling myself in anything." "No," Thomas agreed too easily. "Of course not. I only mean to say, as a friend to your family, understand nothing more that these old houses have long memories, Miss Whitmore. Your aunt's situation is more precarious than perhaps you realize. That cottage isn't hers outright, never has been. It sits on Caldwell land on Caldwell charity has done for 6 years now, and charity, unlike land, can always be reconsidered." He let that sit a moment, watching it land. "I'd hate to see an old friendship cost your aunt her roof. I truly would." The threat was so smoothly delivered, wrapped in such gentle concern, that Clara understood at once why it had worked on so many people in this county for so many years. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like wisdom kindly offered. "I'll bear that in mind, Mr. Caldwell," she said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "I do hope you will." Thomas settled his hat back on his head, the pleasant mask never once slipping. "Give my regards to your aunt. And Miss Whitmore, I do look forward to seeing you at the Fairweather Harvest Ball. Such a lovely tradition. I find it always brings out the truth in people, one way or another." He was gone before Clara could decide whether that last line had been an invitation or a warning. She suspected, standing there with her hand still braced against the doorframe, that it had been both. She told William everything that evening, meeting him at the edge of the Whitmore property, under cover of dusk, and watched his face darken with every word. "He knows," William said. "Or he suspects enough to start applying pressure before we've done anything at all." "He's guessing," Clara said. "If he knew for certain what we meant to do, he wouldn't have bothered with a polite warning at my front door. He'd have simply stopped it. Or he's letting you know he could stop it, so you'll stop yourself and save him the trouble." William raked a hand through his hair, frustration and fear tangled together plain on his face. "Clara, if he's willing to threaten your aunt's roof over a walk into town, I don't like to think what he'd do over you standing in his study reading his private ledgers. Then we make certain I'm not caught," Clara said, though her own pulse hadn't slowed since Thomas left her doorstep. "William, listen to me. If we stop now, if we let him frighten us into doing nothing, then he wins simply by being frightening. That can't be the whole of his strategy. He can't threaten every person who might ever ask him a question for the rest of his life. He's done fair well on that strategy so far," William said grimly. "Whole county's scared enough of him that 70 people stood in that hall 2 nights past and let him call me a liar to my face without one of them saying otherwise." "Then let's be the ones who finally don't stay quiet," Clara said. William looked at her for a long moment in the fading light. Something complicated moving behind his eyes. Fear for her, she thought, but also something that looked almost like the boy she remembered from her family's old porch, the one who used to say her stubbornness would either save them both or get them both killed one day. 4 days, he said finally. Fair weather ball, I'll be close. If there's so much as a candle out of place that shouldn't be, Clara, you walk out of that room and don't look back. Do you hear me? I hear you, Clara said, and did not promise anything more than that. The Fairweather Harvest Ball drew half the county the way these gatherings always did. And Clara had never before been so grateful for the particular blindness of wealthy households toward the poor relations who moved through them like furniture. She arrived with her aunt, greeted the Fairweathers with practiced warmth, danced exactly 2 obligatory dances with elderly gentlemen who mistook her politeness for real interest, and watched all the while. For the moment, Thomas Caldwell settled into conversation deep enough to hold him for a good stretch of time. It came just past 9 when Thomas fell into an animated discussion of crop prices with 2 other landowners, brandy in hand, the particular loose posture of a man who considered his evening's obligations largely fulfilled. Clara caught William's eye across the room. One brief glance. Nothing more. The kind of look 2 strangers might exchange by accident, and slipped out through the side hall toward the carriages where a hired trap William had arranged sat waiting in the shadow of the stable. The ride to Caldwell Manor took less than 15 minutes. It felt to Clara like an hour. The house itself stood mostly dark, the household staff given the evening's liberty, since the family was known to be out, save for a single lamp burning in the kitchen wing, where the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Boyle, kept her own quiet vigil. Clara knew the house well enough to avoid that side entirely slipping. Instead, through the garden door she'd used a dozen times before, when Thomas summoned her to copy correspondence on short notice. Her heart was hammering so hard by the time she reached the study door that she had to stand a moment in the dark hallway, one hand pressed flat against her chest, forcing her breath to slow. 20 minutes, she told herself. You've been in this room 100 times. The difference she understood, as she finally turned the handle and stepped inside, was that every one of those 100 times she'd had permission. Wow. The study was exactly as she remembered it. Heavy oak desk shelves of ledgers organized by year in Thomas's own particular system, the faint smell of pipe tobacco and old paper that seemed to live permanently in the room's dark corners. Clara lit no lamp, working instead by the thin moonlight through the tall windows, her eyes adjusting slowly as she moved to the shelf of ledgers marked with the years she needed. 1811. The year William was declared dead. Her hands shook as she pulled the volume free and laid it open across the desk, and for one terrible moment she thought her nerve might fail her entirely, that she'd stand here frozen, wasting the 20 minutes on fear instead of purpose. Then she thought of William standing in that hall 2 nights past, of Thomas's smile as he handed him that folded paper, and her hands steadied. She found it faster than she expected, which frightened her almost as much as finding it at all. A transaction dated the 14th of November, 1811, 6 weeks, she calculated, quickly after the Army's official notice of William's death would have reached Virginia. A transfer of some 4,000 acres of Harrison land, the western parcels bordering the river, sold not to a neighboring farmer or a Virginia family, but to an entity Clara had never once encountered in 2 years of copying Thomas's correspondence. The Blackwood Land Company. The sale price, written in Thomas's own careful hand, was less than half what such acreage would fetch on any honest market, the kind of figure a man accepts only when he's desperate to close quickly, or when the land was never truly his to price fairly in the first place. And beneath the transaction, tucked into the ledger's margin in smaller script, a notation that made Clara's breath catch entirely. Per power of attorney, W. Harrison, deceased, executed October 2nd, 1811. She stared at that line for a long moment, doing the arithmetic her memory refused to let go of, even when her heart was pounding fit to burst from her chest. The 2nd of October. 3 full weeks before the Army's notice of William's death had even reached Thomas Caldwell. She knew that date for certain, because she'd copied the condolence letters Thomas sent out herself, dated the 23rd of October. William could not have granted power of attorney for land. He was declared to have died possessing, using a document dated before anyone in Virginia even knew he might be dead. It was forged. It had to be forged. And whoever had forged it had done so with careful enough foresight to date it just early enough to seem plausible, just late enough to slide past a grieving family's notice in the chaos of loss. Clara heard distantly a clock somewhere in the house strike the quarter hour, and understood with a jolt that she'd already used more than half her allotted 20 minutes standing frozen over a single page. She could not take the ledger. Removing it would be noticed within the day, and there was no explaining away a missing volume from a locked study. She had exactly one tool available to her, the same tool she'd relied upon her whole life to make herself useful in a world that had little other use for her. She read the page again, and again, fixing the date, the acreage, the sale price, the buyer's name, the notation of the power of attorney into memory, the way she'd once fixed 312 letters worth of longing into paper with total desperate concentration. She was closing the ledger, sliding it back onto its shelf with hands that had begun to shake again, now that the reading was done, when she heard footsteps in the hall outside. Dazad. Clara's whole body went cold. There was no time to reach the garden door. The footsteps were coming from that very direction, unhurried, the particular heavy tread of a man who had no reason to expect anyone else awake in the house. She had perhaps 3 seconds to decide, and she used them the only way. 6 years of invisibility had taught her to use anything. She reached for the nearest stack of correspondence on the desk, seized a pen from the inkwell, and was seated in the chair, bent industriously over a half-finished letter when the study door opened. Miss Whitmore. It was not Thomas. Relief crashed through her so hard she nearly dropped the pen, though she kept her face schooled into mild, practiced surprise as she looked up to find Caldwell's steward, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Ezra Pruitt, standing in the doorway with a lamp raised. "Mr. Pruitt," Clara said, letting her voice carry just the right note of flustered apology. "Goodness, you gave me a fright. I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion. Mr. Caldwell asked me some days past to finish the Richmond correspondence before the harvest ball, and I confess it entirely slipped my mind until this evening. I hoped to have it done and out of the way before he returned and found it wanting." It was, she knew. Even as she said it, a thin excuse the ball was tonight, not some future evening, and any reasonable person might wonder why she'd left the Fairweather gathering to attend to it now of all times. But she said it with such easy apologetic confidence that she watched Pruitt's sharp expression soften into something closer to weary indulgence. "Mr. Caldwell does keep a body busy," Pruitt said, lowering the lamp slightly. "You gave me a start yourself, ma'am. Wasn't expecting anyone in the house tonight save Mrs. Boyle and myself." "I shan't be but a few more minutes," Clara said, gesturing vaguely at the unfinished letter beneath her hand, praying he would not step close enough to see that it was, in fact, 3 sentences of nothing addressed to no one in particular. "I do hate to leave work undone. You know how Mr. Caldwell feels about tidiness." "That I do." Pruitt's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than Clara liked, though whether from suspicion or simple curiosity, she couldn't say. "I'll leave you to it then. Lock the garden door on your way out if you please. Mr. Caldwell's particular about it these days." "Of course," Clara said, and did not breathe again properly until his footsteps had faded down the hall, and she heard somewhere distant a door close. She sat frozen a full minute longer, waiting to be certain he was truly gone before she gathered the useless letter, folded it into her reticule, to dispose of later, and made her way out through the garden door with a steadiness she did not feel in the slightest. William was waiting exactly where he'd promised, in the shadow of the stable, and the moment she reached him, she saw the relief break across his face like sunrise. "You're white as a sheet," he said, gripping her hands. "What happened?" "I found it," Clara said, and her voice shook now that there was finally no one left to perform steadiness for. "William, I found it, and someone very nearly found me." She told him everything on the ride back. The ledger, the date, the impossible power of attorney, signed 3 weeks before anyone knew William might be dead, and watched the color drain from his own face as the shape of it settled over him. "He sold my family's land," William said slowly, using a forged document weeks before the army even confirmed I was dead. That's not a man who saw an opportunity after the fact, Clara. That's a man who knew I wasn't coming back before the rest of the world did. Which means, Clara said the thought forming even as she spoke it, that whoever ambushed your column 6 years ago didn't do it for the reasons Silas overheard alone. Somebody needed you gone specifically so that land sale could go through clean. Somebody needed a dead man's signature on a document dated before he was dead. Thomas, William said, and this time there was no question in it at all, only cold, settled certainty. He didn't just profit from my absence, Clara. He arranged for it. They sat with that in silence for a long moment, the trap rattling over the dark road, both of them staring into a truth too large to hold steady all at once. There's more, Clara said finally. The buyer, Blackwood Land Company. I've never once seen that name in 2 years of copying his correspondence, William, not until tonight. Whoever they are, they're not local, and they're not the sort of buyer a man works with openly. Then we find out who they are, William said. And we find someone with the standing to make what you saw tonight matter in a courtroom before Thomas finishes whatever he means to finish. There's a magistrate 2 counties over, Clara said slowly, an idea taking shape. Judge Ambrose Kellerman. My father did business with him once years ago before he passed. He has a reputation for fairness. Even the Caldwells speak carefully around. If anyone in Virginia would hear this out without Thomas's money already sitting in his pocket, it might be him. Then that's where we start, William said. Tomorrow. They did not make it to tomorrow before the ground shifted beneath them again. Clara woke the next morning to the sound of raised voices in the front room, and came downstairs to find her aunt standing pale and rigid in the doorway, a folded letter trembling in her hand, and a Caldwell messenger boy already retreating down the front path on horseback. "What is it?" Clara asked, though something in her chest had already gone cold with dread before her aunt answered. "It's from Thomas," Margaret said, and her voice cracked on the name. "Clara, he's given notice. We're to vacate the cottage within the fortnight. He cites—" She looked down at the letter, reading with visible difficulty, as though the words pained her physically. "He cites financial reconsiderations regarding tenants of, and I quote, questionable loyalty to the family that has long sustained them." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. "He's punishing you," she said. "For me. I don't care whose fault it is," Margaret said, and there were tears standing in her eyes now. 6 years of careful survival crumbling in the space of one folded letter. "I care that in 2 weeks' time I will have nowhere to put a roof over either of our heads, and I have no family left who can offer us one." Clara took the letter with hands that had gone numb, reading Thomas's careful, cruel phrasing for herself. Questionable loyalty, dressed up in language polite enough to be repeated in any drawing room in the county, without anyone once suspecting it for the threat it truly was. He had warned her at her own front door. She had not listened. And now the cost of that had landed not on her, but on the one person who'd sacrificed most to keep her safe these 6 years. Clara folded the letter with hands gone very still. A cold, clear resolve settling into her chest where the fear had been a moment before. 2 weeks, she said quietly. "Clara?" "Then we have 2 weeks to reach Judge Kellerman," Clara said, "before Thomas Caldwell has a chance to bury every last piece of proof that he's a thief as well as whatever else he is." She was already reaching for her bonnet when the second knock came at the door, sharper this time, more urgent. And when Margaret opened it, it was not a messenger boy standing on the step, but William himself, breathing hard, as though he'd run the whole distance from town. His face grim in a way that told Clara before he'd said a single word that the news he carried was worse than the letter still clutched in her hand. "Clara," he said, "it's Silas. He's gone." William's words hung in the doorway like smoke that wouldn't clear. "Gone how?" Clara said, though some part of her already knew the answer wouldn't be a kind one. "His wife came looking for me at first light," William said, still catching his breath. "Said he never came home last night. Said he left the smithy near dusk, same as always, told her he'd be along after he closed up the accounts, and never walked through his own door." His hands were shaking. Clara noticed in a way she hadn't seen since the ballroom 2 nights before. Clara, I told him he'd be safer keeping quiet a while longer, and instead I dragged him straight into the middle of this by asking him to talk at all. You didn't drag him anywhere, Clara said, though her own stomach had gone tight and cold. He chose to help you. That's not the same thing. Tell that to his wife, William said grimly. She's got 2 children under 6 and a husband who might be lying in a ditch somewhere on account of a conversation I started. Margaret, still holding Thomas's eviction letter, looked between the two of them with an expression caught somewhere between fear and something harder, something that Clara had not seen in her aunt's face in a long while. This has gone past a land dispute, she said quietly. A man is missing, Clara. This is no longer a matter for a girl with a good memory and a magistrate 2 counties over. This is the sort of trouble that gets people killed, which is exactly why we can't stop now, Clara said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. Aunt Margaret, if Thomas is willing to make a blacksmith disappear over an overheard conversation from 6 years past, then waiting is not the safe choice anymore. Waiting is how people like him win. William was already moving toward the door. I need to see the smithy. See if there's anything there that'll tell us which direction he went or who came for him. I'm coming with you, Clara said. Clara. You can argue with me on the walk, she said, already reaching for her bonnet a second time that morning. Or you can argue with me while we're moving. Either way, I'm not staying in this house waiting for the next letter to arrive. The smithy sat dark and cold. When they reached it, the forge unlit for the first morning in longer than anyone in town could remember. Silas's wife, a thin, sharp-faced woman named Ruth, with a baby balanced on one hip and a second child clinging to her skirts, met them at the door with eyes red-rimmed from a night of not sleeping. He never does this, Ruth said before William had even finished his greeting. 6 years married Captain and Silas Cobb has never once failed to come home without sending word first. Something's happened to him. I know it in my bones. When did you last see him? William asked, gentle in a way that surprised Clara, the same soldier steadiness he'd shown in the ballroom folded now into something softer, more careful for a frightened woman and her children. Yesterday evening near dusk, Ruth said. A man came by the shop, well-dressed. Not from around here. I don't think I didn't know his face. Silas told me to take the children on home, said he had business to finish up and he'd not be long. That was the last I saw of him. Clara felt a chill move through her. Did he say what kind of business? No, ma'am, but he looked... Ruth hesitated, jaw working. He looked the way he used to look right after he come home from the war. That careful sort of quiet, like a man watching a door he expects trouble to walk through. William's face had gone hard and pale. Did you see which way the man came from? Which way he left? Rode in from the East Road, Ruth said. Fine horse. Finer than anybody local keeps save the Caldwells and the Fairweathers. She looked between William and Clara, now something desperate creeping into her voice. Captain, please, if this has anything to do with whatever trouble you've brought back with you, I need to know. I have 2 babies and no husband home, and no coin coming in past what's already in that till. William reached into his coat without hesitation and pressed what little money he had into her hand, closing her fingers around it before she could refuse. I'll find him, he said. I give you my word, Ruth. Whatever it costs me. They searched the smithy together, while Ruth took the children inside, moving through the cold forge room with the particular care of people looking for signs that weren't meant to be found. It was Clara who spotted it first, not in the main room, but tucked behind the water barrel near the back door, half hidden beneath a fallen horseshoe. A scrap of paper torn as though ripped hastily from a larger sheet with a few words scrawled across it in handwriting, too shaky to have been written calmly. Tell Harrison Blackwood ain't the buyer. Blackwood's the sentence ended there, the paper torn clean through whatever final word Silas had meant to write, lost entirely. He was trying to leave word, William said, his voice gone rough. He knew something was coming for him, and he tried to warn me before it did." "Blackwood's the what?" Clara said, staring at the torn edge, as though sheer will might reveal the missing word. "William, if he found something out after we spoke to him, something about who's truly behind that land company, then whoever's behind it knew he'd found it too." William finished grimly, and moved to silence him before he could pass it along. Clara's mind was already racing through everything she'd read in that ledger 4 nights past. The sale price too low for honest land, the forged power of attorney, dated weeks before anyone in Virginia knew William might be dead, the buyer's name that had meant nothing to her until this very moment. "We need Judge Kellerman," she said. "Now, not in 2 weeks, William. Today if we can manage it." "It's near a full day's ride to his county," William said. "Longer if the weather turns." "Then we'd best not waste any more of this morning standing in a cold smithy," Clara said. They had made it barely a mile past the edge of town, William driving the borrowed trap harder than was strictly wise on the rutted road, when a rider came up fast behind them and pulled his mount across the path ahead, forcing William to haul back on the reins hard enough that Clara was thrown forward against the seat. It was Ezra Pruitt. Thomas Caldwell's steward still mounted, his sharp face flushed from riding hard, and behind him close enough that Clara's heart dropped straight into her stomach. 2 more riders, she didn't recognize both of them, with the particular blank, watchful look of men paid to be somewhere and ask no questions about why. "Captain Harrison," Pruitt said, his voice carrying none of the polite deference from the night in the study. "Mr. Caldwell requests your presence back at the manor, immediately." "I've got business elsewhere today, Pruitt," William said, his voice gone flat and careful, in the way Clara now recognized as danger held tightly in check. "Tell your employer I'll call on him when it suits me." "I'm afraid it wasn't offered as a request, Captain." Pruitt's eyes flicked to Clara, lingering there a beat too long. "Miss Whitmore as well. Mr. Caldwell was most particular that both of you be brought along." "Brought," Clara repeated, and felt William's hand tighten on the reins beside her. "His word, not mine, ma'am." Something almost like sympathy crossed Pruitt's face for half a second before it vanished behind professional blankness again. "I'd not test him today if I were the 2 of you. He's not in a temper for refusal." Clara looked at William and saw the same calculation running behind his eyes that was running behind hers. 3 armed men on the road, no clear path around them, and a full day's ride still ahead of them if they somehow slipped free. Refusing outright here now, with no witnesses, but Thomas's own men, felt like precisely the sort of foolish bravery that got people found in ditches. "We'll come," William said low. "But I'll drive my own trap, Pruitt. And you'll tell your employer plain that I don't take kindly to being fetched like a hound." "I'll tell him exactly that, Captain," Pruitt said, already turning his horse, "though I suspect he already knows it and finds a certain use in it regardless." Caldwell Manor looked different in the flat gray light of morning than it had under ballroom candles, smaller somehow, and colder, the great house stripped of its performance and left with only its bones showing. Thomas received them, not in the grand hall, but in his study, the very room Clara had stood in 4 nights past, with her heart in her throat, and the sight of him seated behind that same desk, that same ledger cabinet at his back, made something in her chest tighten painfully. "Miss Whitmore?" Thomas said, not rising. "Captain, do sit. I find conversations go so much smoother when everyone's comfortable." "We'll stand," William said. Thomas's smile flickered just slightly, but he did not press it. Instead, he opened a drawer at his desk and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper, setting it down between them with the deliberate care of a man laying out a winning hand at cards. "I received a rather troubling report this morning," he said. "It seems a woman in town has gone to the sheriff claiming her husband, a blacksmith. I believe formerly of the army, has gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Terrible thing. I do hope he turns up safe." His eyes moved from William to Clara, and back again unhurried. "Strange, though. I understand this same blacksmith was seen speaking at some length with the 2 of you not 4 days past. Something about old war stories, I'm told." "You've been having us watched," William said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been having concern for you, cousin, which is a considerably kinder way of putting it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You see, William, I've spent 6 years believing you dead and grieving accordingly. Now you return, and within days, a man who served alongside you vanishes entirely, and my own study appears to have hosted a rather curious late-night visitor during the Fairweather ball. His gaze settled on Clara with a weight that made her skin crawl. Pruitt mentioned finding you here that evening, Miss Whitmore. Working on correspondence, he said. Peculiar choice of evening for it, don't you think, given the ball was that very night? Clara felt her pulse hammering, but kept her face perfectly still. 6 years of practiced composure, the only shield she had left. I finish what I start, Mr. Caldwell. You've said as much yourself more than once. So I have. Thomas's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind it now. I do wonder, though, what precisely you found so absorbing that evening. My ledgers are rather dry reading for most tastes. I was finishing correspondence, Clara said again evenly. Nothing more. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and Clara made herself hold his gaze without blinking. Though her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs, she felt certain he must be able to see it. Of course, Thomas said finally, and let it drop, though the way he said it made clear he believed nothing of the sort. He turned his attention back to William. In any case, I've decided out of family feeling to give you one final chance to spare us all a great deal of unpleasantness. Confirm publicly before the county magistrate that your 6 years' absence was entirely your own. Doing some private matter. A broken heart. Whatever story you prefer, and I'll see to it this desertion inquiry quietly disappears. No charges, no further questions asked. You can resume your life, marry your devoted Miss Whitmore, if you're so inclined, and we need never speak of any of this again. And if I don't, William said, then I'm afraid the War Department's questions will proceed to their natural conclusion. Thomas said, and a man convicted of desertion tends to find very little sympathy left for him in polite society. Nor, I'd imagine from the families of women who once wrote him letters, he never had the decency to answer. The threat landed exactly where it was meant to, and Clara saw William's jaw clench so tight, a muscle jumped along it. You're offering to bury the truth, William said, in exchange for my silence about what actually happened to me, about who arranged that ambush. Something flickered across Thomas's face, so brief, Clara might have imagined it. Except she'd spent 6 years learning to read the smallest movements of powerful men's expressions, and she knew what she'd seen. Fear, just for an instant, quickly smoothed away. I don't know what wild-tail captivity has put in your head, cousin, Thomas said, but I'd think carefully before repeating it anywhere a person of consequence might hear. Wild accusations against a man of my standing tend to reflect rather poorly on the accuser's own credibility. Especially an accuser with no proof, no witnesses, and a rather convenient 6-year absence nobody can verify. I have a witness, William said. Had one at least until he went missing yesterday evening, shortly after a well-dressed stranger rode into town asking after him. The room went very still. That's a serious accusation, Captain. Thomas said, his voice gone soft and dangerous in a way that made the hair on Clara's arms rise. It's an observation, William said. I'll leave the accusing to the judge. They left Caldwell Manor 20 minutes later with nothing resolved, and everything worse, the threat hanging over them heavier now than it had that morning. William didn't speak again until they were well clear of the manor gates, his hands white-knuckled on the reins. He's frightened, Clara said quietly, once they'd put a mile of road behind them. Did you see it, William, when you mentioned the witness? Just for a second before he covered it. I saw it, William said grimly. A man that's certain of himself doesn't flinch at a blacksmith's disappearance unless he already knows exactly what that blacksmith might have said. We still don't know where Silas is, Clara said, the worry she'd been holding down all morning finally breaking through. William, what if we're too late? What if whatever happened to him already happened and there's nothing left to... Don't? William said sharper than he meant to, and then gentler, don't say it. Not yet. We keep moving until we know different. They had gone perhaps another 2 miles when Clara spotted movement in the tree line ahead, a figure moving slow and unsteady, half stumbling along the edge of the road as though every step cost something dear. William. Her hand closed on his arm. William stopped the trap. He pulled up hard, and both of them were down and moving before the wheels had fully stopped. And it was only when they were close enough to see the man's face swollen along one side, a cut above his eyebrow, crusted dark, his shirt torn and stained, that Clara recognized him at all. "Silas," William breathed, catching the man as his legs finally gave out beneath him. "Silas, thank God. Thank God you're alive." "Captain," Silas managed his voice a broken rasp. "Figured you'd come looking eventually." "Who did this to you?" William demanded, lowering him carefully to sit against a fallen log at the road's edge. Clara already tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the worst of the cut above his eye. "Never got a name," Silas said. "Man who came to the shop yesterday evening, the well-dressed one, he wasn't alone. Had 2 more waiting outside. Told me plain they knew I'd been talking. Told me I ought to reconsider how much I remembered about that camp for the sake of my wife and my babies." He winced as Clara pressed the cloth harder against the wound. "I told them I didn't remember nothing worth their trouble. They didn't believe me. Worked me over some to help my memory along. Then left me out past the old mill, told me to walk home slow and think hard on what I told folks going forward." "They meant to frighten you into silence," Clara said. "Not kill you." "Reckon that's about the size of it," Silas agreed grimly. "Which tells me whoever's behind this needs me alive to keep quiet, more than they need me dead to stay quiet permanent. Man doesn't beat a fellow half to death and leave him breathing unless he's got a reason to keep him breathing." William's face had gone hard as stone. "The scrap of paper you left, behind the water barrel. You were trying to tell me something before they found you." Silas's eyes sharpened, despite the pain plainly written across his face. "You found that?" "Blackwood ain't the buyer," William said. "Blackwood's the what?" "Silas. What did you learn?" Silas was quiet a moment, glancing between William and Clara, as though weighing one final time whether the truth was worth what it might cost all 3 of them to speak it aloud. "Man who came to the shop," he said finally. He wasn't careful with his words the way the fellow at that camp was. Got angry part way through, started talking faster than he meant to. Said something about how the Blackwood Land Company weren't never a real buyer at all. Said it was just paper. A name on a deed to keep the real money hidden behind. He looked up at William, and something grim and certain settled into his battered face. Said the real man behind Blackwood was standing closer to home than anybody in this county would ever think to look. "Thomas," William said. "Didn't say the name outright," Silas admitted. "But Captain who else stood to gain from a Harrison presumed dead and land sold off cheap through a company that don't exist nowhere but on paper." They got Silas back to town as gently as the trap allowed, delivered him into his wife's tearful, furious care. And it was there in the small kitchen behind the smithy that Ruth Cobb, pale and shaking but fierce, with the particular fury of a woman who'd nearly lost everything, pressed one more piece into the puzzle that changed the shape of everything they thought they understood. "There's something you should know," Ruth said once Silas had been settled and the worst of his wounds tended. "Before Silas ever spoke to you, Captain, another man came through here, weeks back, before you even come home." Clara went very still. "What man?" "Older gentleman, fine clothes, careful manners. Said he was doing research for a book on the frontier campaigns, soldiers' stories, that sort of thing." Ruth's mouth twisted with the memory. "Silas talked to him some back before we knew any better. Told him about the ambush about the camp, same as he told the 2 of you. Man wrote it all down careful in a little book and thanked him kindly and left." "When was this?" William asked, his voice tight. 2 months back, maybe more. Long before anybody in this county knew you were coming home at all." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her a second time that day. "William, if someone was already collecting these accounts 2 months before you returned, then somebody already knew I was alive." William finished, the color draining from his face. Knew I was alive and coming home long before I ever set foot in Caldwell Manor. Somebody's been building a case against me, or against the truth, since before I even crossed back into Virginia. Or somebody's been building a case for something else entirely, Clara said slowly, a new and terrible thought taking shape. William, what if the man collecting those stories wasn't working for Thomas at all? What if he was working against him? The room went silent. Silas, battered and exhausted, looked up sharply from where he sat. "There's a name I ain't given you yet," he said. "Man who beat me yesterday before he left, he let one more thing slip he likely didn't mean to. Said his employer had been patient long enough waiting on Caldwell to finish paying off what he owed. Said patience was running thin." "Owed," Clara repeated. "Owed on what?" "Didn't say," Silas admitted. But it weren't the talk of a man protecting his own secret captain. It was the talk of a man collecting on somebody else's debt. They rode for Judge Kellerman's county that same afternoon, the day already half spent, and the road ahead longer than any of them liked to think about. But staying still no longer felt like an option to any of them. William drove hard, Clara beside him, with the memorized details of the forged ledger entry running through her mind, like a prayer she couldn't stop repeating. And Silas, against his wife's tearful protests and his own body's clear objections, insisted on coming along as a witness, his battered face a piece of evidence no magistrate could easily wave away. "If Thomas owes money to whoever's truly behind Blackwood," Clara said as the afternoon light began its long, slow fade toward evening, "then he's not the architect of this at all. He's a debtor. Someone with far more power than Thomas Caldwell forced him into selling your land, William, and he's spent 6 years scrambling to cover the cost of it. Doesn't make him innocent," William said grimly. "Man still sold my family's land using a forged signature. Still let my mother die grieving a son he had every reason to suspect might still be alive." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't make him innocent, but it might make him afraid enough of something bigger than himself to do something reckless if he feels cornered." They had gone perhaps another 6 miles, the light failing fast now when the trap's front wheel struck something hard in the rutted road and split with a crack loud enough that all 3 of them were thrown hard against the seat, the whole vehicle lurching sideways before William hauled the panicked horse to a stop. "Everyone all right?" William demanded, already down and checking Clara, then Silas, both shaken but unhurt. It was Clara who saw it first in the last gray light. The wheel hadn't simply struck a stone. It had struck a length of chain, half buried in the road's rutted surface, deliberate and out of place in a way no natural wear could account for. "Someone put that there," she said, her voice gone very quiet. "William, someone knew which road we'd take." Silas, wincing, pulled himself upright against the tilted trap, scanning the darkening tree line with the particular sharpened instinct of a man who'd spent 2 years learning to read danger in silence. "We ain't alone out here," he said grimly. "I can feel it plain as I could back in that camp." William's hand had already gone to the pistol tucked beneath his coat, the one Clara hadn't known he carried until this exact moment, and something in the deliberate, quiet way he checked. It told her this was not the first time in 6 years he'd had cause to. "Clara," he said, low and urgent, "get behind me." "William, now." A voice came out of the tree line before she could argue further, calm and almost pleasant, in a way that made it so much worse than shouting would have been. "Evening, Captain," the voice said. "Awful late to be traveling this road, especially with such precious cargo." 3 shapes separated from the shadows of the trees, and even in the fading light Clara recognized the well-dressed man at their center, from Ruth Cobb's description. Alone, fine clothes, entirely wrong for a country road manner. Too smooth for honest business, and eyes that moved over the 3 of them with the flat, patient calculation of a man who had done this sort of work many times before and expected to do it many times again. "You've got no business here," William said, positioning himself fully between the stranger and Clara. "Funny?" the man said, still pleasant, still unhurried. "I was about to say the very same thing to you." Riding hard for the county line, the three of you at this hour with a blacksmith who ought to be home nursing his wounds instead of gallivanting about the countryside." His gaze settled on Clara, and something in it made her skin crawl worse than anything Thomas Caldwell had ever aimed her way. And a young lady who's apparently taken quite an interest in matters that were never rightly hers to be interested in. "Who sent you?" William demanded. The man smiled slow and unhurried, and did not answer directly. "Let's just say," he said instead, "that my employer has grown considerably less patient than he once was waiting on Mr. Caldwell to make good on certain obligations. And it occurs to him that a captain returned from the dead dragging witnesses and forged ledgers into daylight is precisely the sort of complication that tends to accelerate a man's patience running out entirely." He took one slow step forward, and William's pistol came up level and steady between them. "I'd stop right there," William said. "I imagine you would." The man didn't stop. Not entirely, though he paused just short of the pistol's reach, something almost amused flickering across his face. "Here's what I'd suggest, Captain, and I do mean this as a kindness, unlikely as that may sound to you just now. Turn this trap around. Go home. Forget whatever you think you found in that ledger. Let Thomas Caldwell handle his own debts in his own time, and my employer will have no further quarrel with you or your lovely companion at all. And if I don't, then I expect this road will prove considerably more dangerous the next time you travel it," the man said. "And I expect it won't only be a wheel that breaks next time." The threat hung in the darkening air, unmistakable and cold. And for a long, terrible moment, nobody moved at all. William's pistol steadied the stranger's calm smile unwavering. Clara's heart hammering so loud, she thought surely it must be audible to everyone standing in that road. Then, from somewhere behind the stranger, a second voice cut through the tension, sharper, closer, and entirely unexpected. "That's quite enough." A rider emerged from the tree line behind the three men, and Clara felt her breath catch entirely at the sight of him. Not another hired thug, not one more faceless threat sent to frighten them back into silence, but a man well past 60, silver-haired and stern-faced, flanked by two others in the plain, unadorned coats of county law. "Judge Kellerman." Clara breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said, his sharp eyes taking in the whole scene in a single sweeping glance, the broken wheel, the pistol, the three armed men frozen now in obvious alarm. "I do believe you were headed to see me. Fortunate then that I decided to ride out and meet you halfway, on account of a letter I received some days back from your late father's old solicitor, informing me that his daughter might one day come seeking my particular attention regarding a matter of some urgency." The well-dressed stranger's composure cracked for the first time, something like real fear flashing across his face before he mastered it. "This doesn't concern the court, Judge. Simply a private disagreement conducted with drawn pistols on a public road in the presence of a county magistrate," Kellerman said crisply, "is very much the court's concern, sir. I'll thank you and your companions to state your names and your business, or I'll have my men escort all three of you into custody until you're inclined to do so." The stranger's eyes flicked once to William's still-raised pistol, once to the two armed men flanking the judge, and made whatever calculation men like him were trained to make in moments of sudden, unexpected exposure. He took one careful step backward, hands raised just slightly. "No business worth troubling the court over," he said, his pleasant voice gone thin and careful now. "We'll be on our way." "See that you are," Kellerman said. "And should I hear of any further accidents befalling this road or the good people traveling it, I'll make it my personal business to learn exactly whose employ you're in, and I promise you that will not go well for him." The three men melted back into the tree line as quickly as they'd emerged, and Clara felt her knees go weak with relief the moment they were gone. William's arm coming around her without either of them quite deciding it should, before either of them was steady enough to stand without it. Judge Kellerman dismounted slowly, his sharp eyes moving over the three of them with the careful assessment of a man who had spent decades learning to read trouble in a person's face. "Well," he said, "I do believe you three have rather a lot to tell me. Perhaps we might do it somewhere with less broken glass and fewer hired guns." Judge Kellerman's home sat 2 miles further down the county road, a modest but solid farmhouse that spoke of a man who valued substance over show. And it was there in a study considerably smaller and less grand than Thomas Caldwell's, but infinitely more welcoming, that Clara finally allowed herself to sit down and shake. "Take your time," Kellerman said, settling into the chair behind his desk while his housekeeper brought tea. Nobody quite had the nerve to drink yet. "I've waited 60-some years to hear a good story. I can wait a few minutes more for a true one." Clara looked at William, and William looked at Silas. And it was Silas, bruised, exhausted but steadier now, with a magistrate's roof over his head, who spoke first. "Judge, I've served this country in uniform," he said. "I've been shot at, starved, and beaten, and I never once thought I'd be more frightened than I was in that camp out west. But I was more frightened yesterday watching 3 men decide whether beating me half to death was punishment enough or whether they ought to finish the job." "Start from the beginning," Kellerman said. "All of it. I'll stop you if I need clarifying." So they told him. William began with the ambush, the years of captivity, the letters read aloud by his captors to break him. Silas filled in what he'd overheard from a different corner of that same camp, the name Caldwell, spoken by men who had no business speaking it. Clara, when it came her turn, laid out the ledger entry from memory, with the same careful precision she'd once used copying Thomas's correspondence, the date of sale, the acreage, the buyer's name, and above all, the power of attorney supposedly signed by William 3 full weeks before anyone in Virginia had reason to believe him dead. Kellerman's expression, warm and patient through the earlier parts of the telling, went very still at that last detail. "Say that again," he said. "The date on the power of attorney." "The 2nd of October, 1811, Clara said. "The Army's notice of Captain Harrison's death didn't reach Virginia until the 23rd. I copied the condolence correspondence myself, Judge. I know that date the way I know my own name." 3 weeks, Kellerman said slowly, before the family even knew there was cause to grieve. He set down the pen he'd been using to take notes and looked at William with something new in his face. Not doubt, Clara realized with relief, but a kind of grim recognition, as though pieces he'd long suspected but never proven had finally found their shape. "Captain Harrison, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you the only soldier this has happened to?" William frowned. "Sir." "In the 6 years you were gone," Kellerman said, "did you ever hear talk from your captors, from other prisoners, anywhere at all, of other men? Other soldiers reported dead whose land might have found its way into the hands of a company that doesn't rightly exist?" The room went very quiet. "There was another prisoner," Silas said slowly before William could answer. "Held in my section of that camp for a spell before they moved him elsewhere. Fellow from up near the Potomac, I believe. Talked some before he was taken off someplace I never learned. Said his family's land had gone to strangers while he was presumed dead too. I didn't think much of it at the time. Man says a lot of things trying to keep his mind occupied in a place like that." Kellerman's jaw had gone tight. "I've had 3 separate petitions cross my desk in the past 2 years, he said, from families of soldiers reported dead in frontier skirmishes, disputing land sales that occurred in the months immediately following those reports. I dismissed the first as an unfortunate coincidence. The second, I confess, gave me pause. The third—" He shook his head slowly. "The third I've had sitting in a drawer for 8 months now, because I lacked the evidence to move against a man with as much standing as the one named in it." "What man?" William asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't surprise him half so much as it should have. "Not your cousin," Kellerman said. "A financier out of Richmond, man by the name of Josiah Vane, deals in land speculation shipping contracts, and if the rumors that never quite reach a courtroom are to be believed, a fair amount of quiet influence over which soldiers' columns find safe passage, and which don't, in exchange for certain considerations from the men who profit when those soldiers never come home." Clara felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place with a cold, sick certainty. Thomas said at the ball that he'd have Blackwood investigated. And at his study yesterday, when William mentioned a witness, Judge, I saw fear on his face. Real fear. Not a guilty man frightened of being caught, but a frightened man caught between two dangers. "You think Caldwell owes this Vane money," William said slowly. "I think," Kellerman said, "that a man who forges a power of attorney and sells his own cousin's land at half its worth is not a man acting purely out of greed. Greed rarely moves that carelessly, that quickly under that much apparent pressure. That's the behavior of a man settling a debt he's desperate to be free of." He looked between the three of them, something resolved settling over his features. "I believe your cousin is not the architect of this scheme, Captain. I believe he is one of several debtors caught inside it, forced to provide land through forgery, through fraud, through whatever means available to satisfy an obligation to a man with far more reach and far less mercy than Thomas Caldwell has ever shown anyone in this county." "That doesn't make him innocent," William said, echoing what he'd told Clara on the road. "No," Kellerman agreed. "It does not. But it may make him useful. A cornered man faced with the choice between ruin at your hands or ruin at Vane's may find himself considerably more inclined to talk than a man with nothing left to lose either way." Chade. Kellerman moved faster than any of them expected once his mind was settled. Within the hour he had dispatched riders, his own men sworn and trusted. Not the sort who could be bought off or frightened away on a dark road to secure formal statements from Ruth Cobb regarding the stranger who'd questioned Silas, and from Silas himself, whose battered face would need no embellishment to make its point before any court in Virginia. "I'll need the ledger," Kellerman said to Clara once the riders had gone. "Not your memory of it, Miss Whitmore, valuable as that clearly is. The physical document. A court will hear a witness's account, but a court will convict on paper." "It's locked in his study," Clara said. "I can't simply walk back in and take it, Judge. Not after yesterday. Thomas as good as told me to my face that he knows something happened in that room." "Then we don't take it," Kellerman said. "We compel it. I'll issue a formal order for the production of Caldwell's land transaction ledgers for the year 1811, citing the petitions already sitting in my drawer as cause. He'll have no legal ground to refuse without drawing exactly the kind of attention he's spent 6 years trying to avoid. He'll destroy it first," William said grimly. "Burn the page, claim the ledger was lost, anything before he lets a judge's order reach his study. Which is precisely why the order won't announce itself," Kellerman said. "I intend to arrive with it in hand, unannounced, alongside a deputy who'll take the ledger into custody the moment it's produced. No warning, no opportunity to tidy up loose pages beforehand." Clara felt something cautiously like hope stir in her chest, for the first time since she'd stood in that study 4 nights past, with her heart in her throat, when, "Tomorrow," Kellerman said. "I see no benefit in giving him more time to grow more frightened, and a frightened man with resources tends to grow dangerous the longer he's left to stew." They stayed the night at Kellerman's farmhouse, William and Silas sharing the small guest room, while Clara took the room usually reserved for the judge's absent granddaughter. And though exhaustion pulled at every part of her sleep, came slow and thin, broken by the memory of that man's calm, patient smile on the darkening road. "I expect it won't only be a wheel that breaks next time." She found William awake before dawn, sitting alone on the farmhouse porch steps, staring out at nothing in the gray pre-dawn light. "You should be resting," she said, settling beside him without quite deciding to. "Can't," he admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that camp hearing them read your letters out loud, and I keep thinking, if I'd never come home, Clara. If I'd stayed gone, let the world keep believing I was dead. Silas would never have been beaten. Your aunt would never have received that eviction notice. You'd never have stood in a dark road with a pistol pointed at a stranger on my account. And Thomas would still be selling stolen land," Clara said quietly. "And whoever this Vane is would still be doing to some other family what he's done to yours, and nobody would ever know to stop him." She reached over, covering his hand with her own. "William, you didn't cause this. You survived it. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel that way at 4 in the morning." He turned his hand over beneath hers, threading their fingers together with a careful, deliberate slowness, as though testing whether the gesture was still welcome after 6 years and everything that had happened since. "I used to imagine this," he admitted. In that camp. Not the beatings, not the questions I taught myself not to think on those, or I'd never have made it through. I thought about you instead. Sitting somewhere quiet, just like this, with nothing worse to worry over than what to plant come spring. That's still ahead of us, Clara said. Once this is finished. Is it? William said, and there was real doubt in his voice now, the soldier's caution, warring with whatever hope he'd allowed himself. Clara, a man like Vane doesn't simply let a debtor's secrets come to light and walk away quiet. If Thomas talks, if he gives up Vane's name to save his own skin, there's no telling what that man's willing to do to keep it buried. Then we'll face that when it comes, Clara said with more steadiness than she entirely felt. I didn't spend 6 years riding to a grave just to lose you to caution, now William Harrison. Something in his face broke open at that relief, love, exhaustion all tangled together, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them, saying everything 6 years and 312 letters never quite managed to. They rode for Caldwell Manor at first light. Kellerman's formal order sealed and ready in his coat, a deputy riding close behind with instructions to take custody of any ledger produced the moment it left Thomas's hands. Clara had insisted on coming over both William's and Kellerman's initial objections on the grounds that she alone could identify the exact volume, the exact page, the exact entry that mattered among Thomas's extensive shelving system. If he tries to hand over the wrong year, she said, or claims the ledger's gone missing entirely, I'll know it before he's finished the sentence. Thomas received them in his study, with considerably less composure than he'd managed on either of their previous visits. His eyes moving quickly from Kellerman's official seal to William's grim face, to Clara standing slightly behind them both. And Clara watched something calculating and afraid move behind his expression, before he mastered it into something resembling his usual smooth hospitality. Judge Kellerman, Thomas said, this is an unexpected honor. Might I ask the occasion? You may read it yourself, Kellerman said, extending the sealed order without preamble. A formal request for production of your land transaction ledgers for the year 1811 on the grounds of ongoing inquiry into fraudulent conveyance of property belonging to one Captain William Harrison, presumed deceased at the time of said conveyance. Thomas's hands, Clara noted, were not quite steady as he took the paper and read it, his face going through several careful arrangements before settling on wounded confusion. Judge, I confess I'm at a loss. My ledgers are entirely in order. I've nothing to hide from any inquiry, and I'll gladly produce whatever documentation the court requires, though. I do think it worth noting that this entire affair seems to have sprung up rather suddenly alongside my cousin's own rather sudden reappearance. The order stands regardless of its timing, Mr. Caldwell, Kellerman said, unmoved. I'll ask you to produce the volume now in my presence. Thomas hesitated just a fraction too long, Clara thought, watching him carefully before he crossed to the shelf, and she felt her stomach drop the moment his hand closed around the wrong volume entirely. 1810, Clara said quietly, before Thomas could hand it over. That's the wrong year, Mr. Caldwell. The volume we require is bound in darker leather third from the left on the second shelf, not the fourth. Thomas went very still, and for one long, terrible moment, Clara thought she'd overplayed her hand entirely, that admitting to such precise knowledge of his shelving would only confirm every suspicion he already carried about her late-night visit. But there was no taking it back now, and she made herself hold his gaze unflinching until he finally reached for the correct volume, with hands that had begun quite visibly to shake. Here, he said, his voice gone thin. Though I'm certain you'll find nothing untoward, Judge. My affairs are entirely. Page 114, Clara said. The 14th of November. Kellerman took the ledger himself, flipping through with careful, deliberate patience, while Thomas stood frozen, watching his composure crumbling by visible degrees with every page turned. When Kellerman finally found the entry, the sale to Blackwood, the sum too low, the power of attorney dated 3 weeks before any notice of death could possibly have reached Virginia, he read it once in silence, then looked up at Thomas with an expression that had gone entirely cold. Mr. Caldwell, he said, Would you care to explain how your cousin signed away his own land 3 full weeks before the army informed anyone in this county that he might be dead?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Clara heard her own heartbeat in her ears. "I can explain," Thomas said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual smooth confidence. "But not here. Not with him standing there." His eyes flicked to William, something raw and frightened moving behind them that Clara had never once seen on Thomas Caldwell's face in 2 years of working in his household. "Judge, if I tell you what I know, I need your word as a man of the law that you'll see me protected. Because the man who truly orchestrated all of this will not forgive me for speaking his name aloud, and I promise you, whatever danger you imagine Captain Harrison and Miss Whitmore have faced this past week is nothing compared to what comes for a man who breaks his silence." Cheer poor. Kellerman's deputy took the ledger into secured custody, and Thomas Caldwell, white-faced and visibly diminished, agreed to give his full account, not in his own study, but at the county courthouse 2 days hence, under formal deposition, with Kellerman's sworn protection extended over him in the meantime. It was not the triumphant confrontation Clara had imagined in her darker moments of anger. These past days, no dramatic unmasking, no satisfying collapse of a villain finally caught. Instead, there was only a frightened, aging man signing his name to a promise of testimony, his hands shaking so badly the ink smeared twice before he managed it clean. "He's terrified," William said once they'd left the manor behind Thomas remaining under guard within his own walls until the deposition. "More terrified of Vane than he ever was of us." "Which tells you everything about the sort of man Vane must be," Clara said quietly. The 2 days that followed passed in careful, watchful waiting. Kellerman's deputies stationed discreetly around both Caldwell Manor and the Whitmore cottage. Though Clara noticed her aunt's eviction notice had gone conspicuously unmentioned by anyone since the ledger's discovery, whether from Thomas's diminished capacity to enforce it or simple oversight amid larger crises, she couldn't say, though she suspected uncharitably that it was likely the former. The morning of the deposition arrived cold and overcast, the county courthouse filling with more onlookers than Clara had expected. Word of a Caldwell scandal traveling faster than any of them could have hoped to contain, drawing curious faces from half the county, eager to witness whatever truth finally emerged. Thomas sat at the front of the room, flanked by his own lawyer and by 2 of Kellerman's deputies, looking smaller somehow than he had in his own grand hall a week before. William sat beside Clara in the gallery, his hand finding hers the moment proceedings began, and Clara held on tight enough that she suspected it must ache him, though he never once complained of it. "Mr. Caldwell," Kellerman said once the room had settled, "you've agreed to give a full and truthful account of the circumstances surrounding the sale of Harrison land in November of 1811 and of your dealings with the entity known as the Blackwood Land Company. Please begin." Thomas's hands trembled visibly as he unfolded a small sheet of notes he'd clearly prepared, though his voice when it came was steadier than Clara expected. "I owed money," he said. "A great deal of it. Gambling debts accumulated over several years foolishly and against my better judgment to a man named Josiah Vane, whose interests extend a good deal further than card tables in Richmond parlors." He drew a shaking breath. "When my debts grew large enough that Vane's patience began to thin, he approached me with an arrangement. He knew I don't to this day know how, but he knew that my cousin William's supply column was to travel a particular route on a particular assignment. He suggested in terms I understood clearly enough, despite their careful phrasing, that certain complications along that route might resolve my debt entirely, provided I was willing to assist afterward with certain paperwork." A murmur ran through the gallery. Clara felt William go rigid beside her. "You knew," William said low and furious, though Kellerman's raised hand kept him from rising. "You knew beforehand. You knew what was going to happen to my column before it ever happened." "I didn't know the particulars," Thomas said, and there was real shame in his voice now, whatever remained of his composure crumbling entirely. "God help me, William. I told myself I didn't know. I told myself Vane's men would simply delay the column, cause some trouble that would see you reassigned, nothing worse. I never let myself imagine. He stopped, pressing a hand to his mouth for a moment before continuing, his voice raw. When word came that you were presumed dead, I told myself it was already done, already past changing, and that the kindest thing I could do for your memory was see your mother's affairs settled cleanly. Vane's man came to me within the month with the forged power of attorney already prepared. I signed where I was told to sign. I told myself it was the only way to clear my own family's name of the debt hanging over it, and that you being dead would never know the difference. And when I came home, William said, alive, standing in your own hall, Vane's men were watching me before you'd even crossed back into Virginia, Thomas said. The man who came asking after your old company that wasn't my doing, William. That was Vane making certain no loose threads remained before you had the chance to pull on them yourself. When you did come home, I was caught between two impossible choices. Confess everything and destroy myself, or protect my silence and hope Vane's reach never quite caught up to you. His voice cracked. I chose the coward's path. I tried to discredit you before you could gather proof, hoping it would end the matter quietly, without ever forcing me to choose between Vane's wrath and yours. Sergeant Cobb, Kellerman said, cutting through the room's rising murmur. You were beaten on Vane's order. Is that your understanding? That's my understanding, Your Honor, Silas said from where he sat near the front, his bruised face still healing, but his voice steady and clear. Man who did it as good as said his employer's patience with Caldwell had run out entire. And the men who threatened Miss Whitmore and Captain Harrison on the road? Kellerman continued. Also in Vane's employ. I believe so, Thomas said quietly. I had no part in that, Judge. I swear it before this whole room. But I won't pretend I was surprised to hear of it. Vane doesn't tolerate loose ends, and by the time Captain Harrison began asking questions in earnest, I imagine he considered William and Miss Whitmore precisely that. Clara felt the whole weight of the past week settle over her at once. The fear in that dark road, Silas's battered face, her aunt's trembling hands around an eviction notice, and understood with a cold clarity that none of it had been Thomas Caldwell's true design at all. He had been, as Kellerman suspected, merely a frightened debtor, caught in a far larger man's scheme, willing to sacrifice a cousin's memory and a poor relation's safety to save his own skin, but never the true architect of the danger that had stalked them all week. It did not make her forgive him, but it did finally tell her exactly whose name deserved the weight of her anger most. Josiah Vane, Kellerman said once Thomas's account had been fully recorded and the room's murmur had settled into something more like stunned silence, is not a man who answers easily to county courts, Mr. Caldwell. His interests span several states, and his methods as you've described them suggest a man well practiced in remaining several careful steps removed from anything that might implicate him directly. Then how do we touch him at all? William demanded, rising despite himself. Judge, if this man's been doing this to soldiers' families for years, if there's other men out there whose land was stolen the same way mine was, then we need more than one debtor's frightened confession to bring him to justice, Kellerman said. We need the paper trail Blackwood itself represents. Mr. Caldwell, does such a trail exist? Records connecting the company directly to Vane's own hand, rather than simply to the debts he collected from frightened men like yourself. Thomas hesitated, and Clara watched something shift behind his eyes. Fear still, but underlaid now with something that looked almost like the desperate calculation of a drowning man, reaching for the only rope left to him. There's a ledger, he said slowly. Vane's own man kept it when he came to oversee the transaction. I saw it once briefly when he came to collect my signature. Full accounting of every parcel Blackwood's acquired this way, going back I don't know how many years. Half a dozen families at least that I recognized names for. Perhaps more I didn't. Where is this ledger now? Kellerman asked. I don't know, Thomas admitted. Vane's man took it with him when he left. But I do know where Vane keeps his primary offices, and I know enough of his habits from 6 years of forced correspondence to guess where such a document might be secured if it exists at all. You'd testify to that. Formally. Before whatever court proves willing to hear it. Thomas looked for a long moment, like a man standing at the edge of a very tall cliff, weighing everything he stood to lose against everything he'd already lost by staying silent this long. I'll testify, he said finally. God help me, I should have done it 6 years ago, before any of this ever touched William or Miss Whitmore at all. I'll testify to whatever this court requires, and I'll bear whatever consequence follows, provided it finally puts an end to what that man's been doing to families who've already sacrificed more than any of us in this room. The deposition closed with Thomas remanded to Kellerman's custody for his own protection, formal charges pending against him for fraud and conspiracy. Though Kellerman made clear both to Thomas and to the gathered room that his cooperation in exposing Vane's larger scheme would weigh heavily in whatever judgment eventually came. It was not justice exactly as Clara had imagined it during those long nights writing letters to a grave, nor exactly the clean, satisfying reckoning she'd pictured during the darker moments of the past week's danger. But it was, she understood, watching William's rigid shoulders finally begin to loosen as the room emptied around them. Something real. Something that might, given time and Kellerman's stubborn commitment to seeing it through, finally reach the man who'd truly orchestrated 6 years of stolen letters, forged signatures, and a mother's grief that need never have happened at all. It's not over, William said quietly once they were outside the courthouse, the cold autumn air, a relief after the packed, breathless room. Vane's still out there, still got reach enough to hurt people who cross him. No, Clara agreed. It's not over, but Thomas is talking William. Silas is alive. Your name's clear of desertion, whatever else remains unresolved. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, the way he'd done on Kellerman's porch 2 mornings before. We've done more in a week than this county's done in 6 years of looking the other way. That has to count for something. William was quiet a long moment, looking out over the gathering crowd, still murmuring about everything they'd just witnessed before he turned back to her with something steadier in his face than she'd seen since the night he first walked back through Caldwell's door. You were right, he said. About not staying still. About not letting fear be the whole of the answer. I generally am, Clara said with a faint, exhausted smile that surprised her by being genuine. You'll want to get used to that, I expect, if you mean to keep me around. Something in William's face broke open at that warm and unguarded, in a way 6 years of captivity and careful silence had never quite allowed, and for the first time since he'd walked back into her life, Clara let herself believe fully and without reservation that whatever came next, Vane the ledger, the long road still ahead of proving the whole rotten scheme. In a court that mattered, they would face it, standing together, and not one moment of it would need 312 unanswered letters to survive. Kellerman did not waste the goodwill of a frightened man's confession. Within a day of Thomas's deposition, he had dispatched sealed letters to magistrates in 2 neighboring states citing Thomas's sworn account and requesting any record of land disputes bearing the fingerprints of a company called Blackwood, and had summoned William and Clara both back to his farmhouse study to lay out in plain terms exactly how thin the ground beneath them still was. A confession from a debtor is a beginning, Kellerman said, pacing behind his desk in a way Clara hadn't seen from him before. Not the calm, unhurried judge who'd ridden out to meet them on a dark road, but a man clearly turning something over hard in his mind. It is not on its own enough to touch a man like Vane. Thomas can testify to what was done to him. He cannot testify to what Vane's done elsewhere, not with any specificity a court would accept as more than hearsay. For that, we need the ledger he described, names, dates, parcels, the full accounting. Gisa I nesasanen kaise. He said Vane's man took it, William said. That it might be at Vane's primary offices in Richmond. Might be, Kellerman repeated. A word doing a great deal of work in that sentence, Captain. Josiah Vane did not build a fortune on carelessness. If such a ledger exists, and if it's still in Richmond at all, I'd wager it isn't sitting in an unlocked drawer waiting for a county judge's polite request. Clara felt the old familiar tightening in her chest, the sense of a door closing just as it seemed to have opened. Then how do we reach it? Carefully, Kellerman said. And not I think through means either of you have any business attempting yourselves. His sharp eyes settled on William with something like a warning. Captain, I understand the impulse burning in you right now. I understand it better than you might credit. But a wronged soldier riding into Richmond to confront a man like Vane directly is precisely the sort of reckless justice that gets good men buried in unmarked graves, and I've had quite enough of Harrison's presumed dead for one lifetime. Then what would you have me do? William said, frustration cracking through his careful composure. Sit here and wait while he decides whether Thomas's confession is worth silencing us all for good. I would have you trust the law to move slower than your anger wants it to, Kellerman said, not unkindly, while it moves considerably more certainly than your anger is capable of on its own. He softened, just slightly, seeing the tension in William's jaw. I've already sent word to a federal marshal I trust in Richmond, a man who's had his own quiet suspicions about Vane's dealings for some time, though never enough evidence to act on them. Thomas's testimony, combined with what Sergeant Cobb can attest to, may finally be enough to secure a lawful search of Vane's offices. That is how we reach the ledger, Captain, not through a door kicked open by a furious soldier, but through one opened by a marshal's warrant. William was quiet a long moment, and Clara watched him wrestle visibly with 6 years of learned self-reliance, 6 years of trusting no one but himself to see a thing through. And if the marshal's warrant comes too slow, he said finally, if Vane hears what's coming and burns the whole ledger before anyone reaches Richmond, then we will have lost a piece of evidence, Kellerman said grimly, and gained the certainty that a man that careful has something enormous left to hide. Either way, Captain, we are closer to the truth than we were a week ago. That has to be worth something, even to a man trained to measure victory only in ground taken. The marshal's letter came back faster than any of them expected, carried by a rider who'd clearly pushed his horse hard the whole distance from Richmond, and Clara felt her stomach drop the moment she saw the grim set of Kellerman's face as he read it. Marshal Whitfield agrees the evidence is sufficient to request a warrant, Kellerman said, but he cautions that word of our inquiry may already have reached Vane's circle. 2 of his known associates were seen departing Richmond in some haste yesterday morning, trunks loaded, destination unknown. He's running, William said. Or he's covering his tracks before he has to, Kellerman said. Either way, Captain, it means we've lost the element of surprise we were counting on. Whitfield means to move on the offices within the day, regardless warrant or no citing exigent circumstance. But I'll not pretend the odds of finding that ledger intact have improved any. Clara felt a cold certainty settle over her, the same instinct that had sent her into Thomas's study 4 nights past, despite every warning telling her not to. There's something we haven't considered, she said slowly. Vane's man came here, to this county, personally to oversee Thomas's forged signature to collect on Silas's silence. A man that careful about his own exposure doesn't send his most sensitive records 2 states away to an office half of Richmond likely knows exists. He keeps the truly damning evidence close. Somewhere, nobody would think to look precisely because it isn't where the law would expect to find it. Kellerman's sharp eyes fixed on her. You have a theory, Miss Whitmore. I have a memory, Clara said. Something Thomas said during his deposition. That Vane's man came to collect his signature personally, and that he'd seen the ledger once briefly when the man came to Caldwell Manor itself. She looked between William and Kellerman, the thought crystallizing even as she spoke it. What if the ledger was never taken back to Richmond at all? What if it's still somewhere closer, somewhere Vane considers safer precisely because it's outside the reach of a Richmond marshal's warrant? Caldwell Manor, William said slowly. Thomas said the man kept it close during their dealings, Clara said. What if close meant exactly what it sounds like? A man collecting on multiple debtors across several counties might find it a good deal more convenient to keep his master accounting somewhere central to his collections, rather than dragging it back and forth to Richmond every time he needed to update a page. Kellerman was already reaching for his coat. It's a theory, Miss Whitmore, a thin one. But thin theories have solved harder cases than this one. and we've precious little time to waste chasing better ones." They rode for Caldwell Manor a final time, Kellerman's warrant now extended to cover a search of the premises given Thomas's own sworn testimony implicating the estate in the scheme, and Clara felt the strange vertiginous sensation of returning once more to a house that had shaped 6 years of her life. This time, not as a poor relation slipping through shadows, but as a woman walking through the front door in broad daylight with a judge's authority at her back. Thomas met them in the hall, still under Kellerman's protective custody, his face gaunt with days of fear and confession. "You think it's here?" he said when Kellerman explained their purpose. "God help me, I never thought to ask where Vane's man kept his true accounting. I only ever saw what he showed me." "Where did he stay when he came to collect your signature?" Clara asked. "Not the study, surely. A man being that careful wouldn't conduct such business anywhere a servant might overhear." Thomas's brow furrowed memory, working slowly through what was clearly still a haze of dread. "The old gatehouse," he said finally, "at the edge of the property near the river road. It's stood empty since my father's time, save when I've let a guest use it for privacy. Vane's man requested it, specifically said he preferred to conduct sensitive business away from the household's ears." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Has anyone been inside since?" "Not that I know of," Thomas said. "I gave orders it be left undisturbed while he used it. Never thought to countermand that after he'd gone." They rode for the gatehouse at a pace that left Clara's hands aching from gripping the trap's rail, and found it exactly as Thomas described, a small weathered structure at the property's edge, shuttered and quiet, looking for all the world like nothing more than an abandoned outbuilding nobody had reason to enter in years. The door was locked, but the lock was old, and it took William only a few minutes with a tool borrowed from Kellerman's deputy to work it free. Inside, the air hung thick with dust and disuse, and for one sinking moment, Clara feared they'd chased a thin theory into an empty room for nothing. Then Kellerman's deputy, methodically checking the small structure's few furnishings, gave a low exclamation from beside a battered writing desk, pushed against the far wall. "Judge, there's a false bottom in this drawer." The ledger they found beneath that false bottom was thicker than the volume Clara had read in Thomas's study, its pages dense with entries spanning years rather than months, and as Kellerman turned through it slowly, his face grew grimmer with every page. "6 families," he said, finally closing the volume with careful, reverent hands, as though it were something both precious and poisonous at once. 6 separate instances going back nearly a decade of soldiers reported dead or missing under circumstances. This ledger connects directly to payments made to and from associates of Josiah Vane. Land seized, sold, and resold through shell companies bearing names as false as Blackwood's. This is not one man's isolated scheme, Captain. This is a business. William stared at the ledger as though it might combust in Kellerman's hands. 6 families, he repeated hollowly. 6 men who never came home so that Vane and men like Thomas could settle their debts on stolen land. Some of those men may yet be alive, Kellerman said. Held as you were in whatever camps Vane's associates maintain for leverage. This ledger gives us names, Captain. A path forward, a chance to find them before it's too late, the way we very nearly failed to find Sergeant Cobb in time. Clara felt the full weight of what they'd uncovered settle over her. Not simply William's own stolen years, but an entire quiet machinery of grief and theft that had ground on unnoticed for a decade, hidden behind respectable names and forged signatures, and a county's willingness to look away from anything that smelled faintly of scandal. This has to reach further than one county court, she said. Judge, this needs federal attention, a scheme spanning multiple states, multiple stolen commissions. It will have it, Kellerman said grimly, already tucking the ledger securely into his coat. Marshal Whitfield's search of Vane's Richmond offices proceeds regardless of what we've found here. But this? He pressed a hand flat against his coat, over the hidden weight of the ledger beneath it. This changes the scale of what we're dealing with entirely. I'll have riders dispatched within the hour to secure federal involvement. This is no longer a matter I can see through alone, nor would I wish to. They did not have the luxury of savoring the discovery for long. They were barely back within sight of Caldwell Manor's main house when a rider came tearing up the drive at a pace that told its own story before the man had even reined in, dust-covered and grim-faced one of Kellerman's own deputies dispatched earlier to watch the roads. "Judge!" The rider gasped, half falling from his horse. "Riders on the river road, 4 of them hard men moving fast toward the gatehouse. I came ahead soon as I spotted them." Kellerman's face went to stone. "Vane's already heard." "How?" William demanded. "We only just found the ledger ourselves not an hour past. A scheme this large doesn't survive a decade without eyes in every county it touches," Kellerman said grimly, already turning his horse toward the main house. "Someone in this very household, or someone watching it, sent word the moment we rode for that gatehouse. We haven't the time to puzzle out who. We need to be behind secured walls now before those 4 riders reach us." They made it back to the manor's main house with what felt to Clara like only minutes to spare, Kellerman's remaining deputies moving quickly to bar the doors and post themselves at the windows, while Thomas, pale and shaking, was hustled into the relative safety of an interior room. "They'll not simply ride up and demand entry," Kellerman said, checking the pistol at his own belt, with the calm, practiced motion of a man who had faced down worse than 4 hired riders in his time. "Vane's men favor quiet and deniability, but 4 men riding hard toward a gatehouse they surely know has already been searched. Means they're not coming for the ledger anymore," William finished grimly. "They're coming for whoever found it." Clara felt cold fear settle deep in her chest, but beneath it, something harder and more resolved than fear had any right to be. "Then let them come," she said. "We have a judge, a sworn deputy, a soldier who survived 6 years of worse than 4 hired men, and a ledger that will hang every one of them the moment it reaches federal hands. Let them come, and let them find out exactly how badly they've miscalculated." William looked at her with something fierce and proud breaking through the fear on his face. "There's the girl who wrote 312 letters to a grave and never once gave up hope," he said quietly. "I'd nearly forgotten how much steel that took." The riders did not in the end storm the house. They came instead as far as the front drive and stopped, and it was the well-dressed stranger from the dark road 2 nights before who dismounted first, his earlier pleasant composure now replaced by something considerably more urgent. "Judge Kellerman," he called out, standing well clear of the house, hands visibly empty at his sides. "I've come to speak plainly, if your deputies would kindly hold their fire long enough to hear it. You've got until the count of 10 to state your business," Kellerman called back from the doorway, his own pistol steady in hand. "My employer wishes to negotiate," the man said. "He understands you've found certain documents. He's prepared to offer considerable compensation for their return, along with his sincere assurance that no further trouble will come to anyone in this household, provided the matter concludes here quietly between reasonable men. Your employer," Kellerman said, "is currently the subject of a federal marshal's search of his own Richmond offices conducted under warrant, secured through sworn testimony, implicating him in the theft forgery, and quite possibly the murder of soldiers reported dead under circumstances he arranged. I'm afraid the time for quiet negotiation between reasonable men has rather passed him by." Something shifted in the stranger's face, not quite panic, but the first real crack Clara had seen in his careful composure across 2 encounters now. "Then I'd ask you to consider," he said, "whether a federal marshal 2 counties distant can arrive faster than 4 men already standing on your own drive, Judge. I'd hate for anyone in that house to discover the answer to that question the hard way." It was, Clara understood immediately, no longer an offer at all. It was the last desperate threat of men who understood their entire scheme was already unraveling and had nothing left to lose by making it violent on the way down. "Get back from the windows," Kellerman said quietly, motioning his deputies into position. "Whatever's about to happen, I'll not have any of you standing exposed for it." What happened next unfolded faster than Clara's mind could properly track, the way violence always seemed to in the stories her father used to tell of frontier skirmishes. Not the slow, deliberate drama of a duel, but a sudden chaotic collision of movement and noise that left everyone changed before anyone had time to fully understand it was happening at all. The four riders surged forward as one not toward the house's main door, where Kellerman's deputies stood ready, but around the side toward the study windows. Clara realized with horror were the very room where Thomas sat, guarded but exposed his testimony, the one thing standing between Vane and complete escape from consequence. "They're going for Thomas," William said, already moving. "They mean to silence him before he can testify federally." "William, stay back, Clara. I mean it." His voice carried none of its earlier gentleness now, only the flat, focused urgency of a soldier who'd spent 6 years learning exactly how fast a situation could turn fatal. He was through the hall and into the study before she could argue further, and Clara, heart hammering, did the only thing 6 years of practiced usefulness had ever taught her to do in a crisis. She moved to help, not to hide. She reached the study doorway in time to see one of Vane's men already through the shattered window pistol, raised toward where Thomas cowered behind an overturned chair, and William crossing the room in 3 long strides to put himself bodily between the weapon and the man he'd spent 6 years believing had betrayed him. "Don't," William said, his own pistol level and steady. "You put that gun down, or I promise you this ends worse for you than for anyone else in this room." The intruder's eyes flicked between William's weapon and the sound of Kellerman's deputies already storming toward the study from the hall, and in that half-second of calculation, Clara watched him make the choice men like him were trained to make when a job went sideways beyond salvaging. He lowered the pistol slowly and raised both hands. "Smart man," William said, not lowering his own weapon an inch until Kellerman's deputies had the intruder fully restrained. Outside, the sound of a brief, sharp scuffle told its own story, and within minutes, Kellerman himself appeared in the study doorway, breathing hard but unharmed, 2 more of Vane's men bound and disarmed behind him. "The fourth's fled," Kellerman said grimly. "Won't get far. I've riders already in pursuit." His eyes swept the room, settling on Thomas, pale and shaking, but unhurt, and on William, still standing protectively between the intruder and the man he'd once sworn to hate. "Captain, you put yourself between a loaded pistol and the cousin who sold your family's land out from under you." William lowered his weapon slowly, something complicated moving across his face as the adrenaline began to ebb. "He's still a Harrison," he said quietly. "Whatever else he's done. And he's the only living witness who can put Vane's whole scheme in a courtroom. I didn't do it for him, Judge. I did it for every family in that ledger who deserves to see this finished properly." Thomas, still shaking, looked up at William with something raw and disbelieving in his face. "You saved my life," he said, "after everything I did. After the eviction notice, the desertion charge, 6 years of letting you be buried while I profited from it, you put yourself in front of a bullet for me." "I didn't do it because I've forgiven you," William said, and his voice was hard though not unkind. "I did it because Clara taught me something this past week I'd nearly forgotten in 6 years of just surviving. Doing the right thing and forgiving someone aren't always the same act, Thomas. Sometimes you do right by a man precisely because you refuse to let yourself become as small as he's been." The federal marshal's search of Vane's Richmond offices, conducted that same afternoon, turned up corroborating correspondence that, combined with the Gatehouse ledger and the testimony of 2 captured hired men, eager to trade information for leniency, proved more than sufficient to secure a warrant for Josiah Vane's own arrest. He was apprehended 3 days later, attempting to board a ship bound for the Caribbean, his careful decade of distance and deniability finally collapsing under the weight of paper trails. He'd never imagined a poor relation's careful memory and a stubborn judge's persistence might expose. Clara learned all of this secondhand through Kellerman's periodic updates over the following weeks, each one arriving like a small, satisfying stone added to a wall finally built high enough to keep danger out for good. 2 of the 6 families named in the Gatehouse ledger were found to have living men still held captive, their release secured through federal intervention within the month, a fact that undid something tight and grieving in William's chest that Clara suspected had been coiled there since the moment he'd first understood the scale of what Vane's scheme had cost beyond his own 6 years. 2 men coming home, William said. The evening word reached them sitting on the Whitmore cottage porch in the last gold light of an early autumn evening. Two families who thought they'd buried someone about to learn different, same as you did with me. They'll have their own version of that ballroom moment, Clara said softly. Their own 6 years of letters, however they kept faith through it. Not everyone keeps faith the way you did, William said, turning to look at her fully. Something warm and unguarded in his face that had been slowly returning day by day since the danger finally lifted. I don't know that I deserved it, Clara. 312 letters to a man who couldn't answer a single one. Most women would have stopped believing long before that. Most women didn't know you the way I did, Clara said simply. I never once believed you'd simply forgotten me, William. Not really. Even when everyone told me I was a fool for holding on. Thomas Caldwell's own reckoning, when it finally came, proved less severe than Clara might once have wished for him, and considerably more severe than his own careful smile had once suggested he believed possible. Kellerman, weighing Thomas's cooperation against the full scope of his crimes, secured an arrangement that saw him stripped of the bulk of his stolen wealth, the land itself returned where possible, to the rightful families it had been taken from, in exchange for testimony that would help secure convictions against Vane and the wider network his scheme had touched. It was not forgiveness. Clara doubted William would ever fully offer that, and she found turning the question over in her own heart that she wasn't certain she wished him to. But it was, she thought. Watching Thomas Caldwell diminished, now stripped of the easy power that had once let him threaten her aunt's roof with a smile. Something like the beginning of the accounting he'd owed for 6 years and never once expected to pay. What will become of him? Clara asked William some weeks later, once the last of the legal proceedings had finally begun winding toward their conclusion. Kellerman says he'll likely serve some years for the fraud once the wider case against Vane concludes, William said. Less than he deserves, probably. More than he ever expected to answer for. He was quiet a moment, turning something over. I went to see him before the sentencing hearing. Told him I meant to see the western parcels, the land he sold, properly returned to my name once the courts finished with the paperwork. Told him I'd use it to build something worth the 6 years it cost me to get it back. What did he say? Not much, William admitted. Thanked me mostly. For the study, I think. For not letting him die on that gatehouse floor when I could have simply let it happen and called it justice. He shook his head slowly. I don't know if I did it out of mercy or out of something colder, Clara. Some part of me that just refused to let Vane win even one more thing, even at Thomas's expense. Maybe it doesn't matter which, Clara said. Maybe what matters is that you chose it, whatever the reason underneath. Margaret Whitmore's eviction notice, unenforced and largely forgotten amid everything that followed, was formally withdrawn within the month, replaced instead by a modest settlement from what remained of Thomas's stripped estate. Not charity this time, but restitution, offered through Kellerman's careful negotiation as partial compensation for the 6 years of dependent uncertainty the Whitmore women had endured under a Caldwell roof, built partly on other families' stolen land. I never thought I'd see the day, Margaret said, turning the settlement papers over in her hands with something like wonder, when this family owed us instead of the other way around. You earned it, Clara said. 6 years of making a home for me with nothing, Aunt Margaret. If anyone in this county deserves a measure of security after all this, it's you. Margaret's eyes were wet when she looked up. I was so frightened, Clara. That whole week. I thought I was losing you to something I couldn't protect you from, the same way I nearly lost you to grief after your parents passed. I didn't know how to watch you walk toward danger instead of away from it. I know, Clara said gently, but I couldn't have done it any other way, not and lived with myself after. You raised me better than that, whether you meant to or not. The autumn deepened, and with it came a settling, not the frantic, breathless urgency of the weeks just past, but something slower and steadier. The particular quiet that comes after a long fever finally breaks. William spent his days working alongside hired hands to restore what remained of the Harrison land. The western parcels returned at last through the courts, walking the boundaries his father and grandfather had once walked, learning the shape of a home he'd been declared dead rather than allowed to properly inherit. Clara found herself there often in those weeks, no longer the quiet poor relation slipping unnoticed through someone else's grand house, but a woman welcome in her own right, sitting on the porch of a half-restored farmhouse, while William worked sharing supper cooked over an open fire when the light failed too fast for finishing chores indoors. It was on one such evening, the sky gone the particular deep gold that only came in the last weeks before true autumn cold set in, that William set down the tools he'd been cleaning and came to sit beside her on the porch steps. Something careful and deliberate in the way he moved that told Clara before he'd said a single word that this evening was different from the dozens that had come before it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about something Thomas said to me. Back before any of this started in that first ballroom conversation, about whether the woman who waited 6 years was fortunate or foolish." "I remember," Clara said. "He couldn't decide which." "I've decided," William said. He reached into his coat and drew out a small worn bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and Clara felt her breath catch as he unwrapped it carefully to reveal a stack of paper, weathered and creased, from long carrying covered edge to edge in handwriting she recognized instantly as her own. "Those are copies," William said quietly. "Not the letters you sent me." "Clara, those never reached me. They were destroyed or taken long before I ever saw them. These are the ones I wrote back. Every single night in that camp after they told me I couldn't send them, after I understood what silence was costing you. I wrote anyway. Wrote you a letter every week for 6 years, knowing full well not one of them would ever reach you, because it was the only way I had left of keeping a promise I couldn't keep any other way." Clara's hands were shaking as she took the bundle from him, the weight of it heavier than paper had any right to be. "6 years of letters," she whispered. "You wrote me 6 years of letters I never received." 311 of them, William said, and something rough moved through his voice. "One short of your own count, Clara, on account of the first few months I still believed I'd be home again before I needed to write at all." He reached out, covering her trembling hands with his own steady ones. "I don't have the 312th yet. I've been saving it, waiting for the right moment to write it properly instead of in the dark, half-starved, not knowing if I'd survive to see it delivered at all. William." Her voice broke on his name. "I mean to write it tonight," he said, "if you'll let me. Not a letter about grief or captivity or 6 years lost to men who thought love was a weakness to be exploited. I mean to write the letter I always dreamed of writing you if I ever made it home. The one that doesn't end in goodbye." Clara felt tears spill freely down her face now, 6 years of grief and hope and fear finally finding somewhere safe to land. "Then write it," she said. "Write it now, William, so I never have to wonder again whether the words existed." He drew a fresh sheet of paper from his coat and a stub of pencil and wrote there on the porch steps in the fading gold light, his hand steadier than Clara had seen it since the night he first walked back through Caldwell's door. When he finished, he did not fold it away or hand it to her to read alone. He read it to her himself, his voice low and certain in the gathering dusk. "Dearest Clara, I have written you letters from the bottom of despair, and I have written you letters from the edge of hope, and I have written more words to you across 6 years of silence than any man has any right to write a woman who never once heard a single one of them. But this is the only letter that has ever truly mattered, because it is the first one I get to deliver myself into your own 2 hands, with nothing left standing between us but the answer you choose to give. I am asking you, Clara Whitmore, to spend whatever years remain to either of us, making certain neither one of us ever has to write the other a letter that goes unanswered again. Will you marry me?" The words hung in the quiet evening air, and Clara found she had no need of composure at all anymore. No 6 years of careful invisibility left to maintain. No reason left to guard her heart against a hope that had finally fully come home to stay. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and certain, and entirely without hesitation. 6 years of longing collapsing at last into something solid and real and hers. Yes, William. 1,000 times yes. They were married the following spring at the restored Harrison farmhouse, with Margaret standing proud beside her niece and Silas Cobb, fully healed. Now his family settled and secure through a portion of restitution, William had insisted on sharing standing as William's witness. His broad face split wide with a grin. Clara had never once seen on him during their darker days together. Judge Kellerman attended too, traveling the distance himself to see through, as he put it, the one part of this whole affair I actually enjoyed presiding over. And it was he who remarked, watching Clara and William exchange their vows beneath the same open Virginia sky that had once watched a dead man walk back into a crowded hall, that he had seen a great many trials in his years on the bench, but precious few endings worth the paperwork quite so much as this one. Thomas Caldwell did not attend. His own sentence had not yet concluded, and Clara understood, watching the ceremony unfold without him, that some doors simply stayed closed, whatever partial redemption a man managed to claw back through late confession and reluctant courage. It did not sadden her. It felt instead like precisely the balance the past year had been building toward. Mercy extended where it mattered, consequence upheld where it must be, and no pretending that the two were ever quite the same thing. Josiah Vane's trial, when it finally concluded that following winter, drew attention from newspapers as far as Boston and Charleston. Both the full scope of his decade-long scheme laid bare at last, before a federal court. 6 families' stolen land, 3 soldiers found alive and returned home through the evidence William and Clara had helped uncover, and a conviction severe enough that Kellerman, writing to inform them of the verdict, allowed himself the rare indulgence of a single triumphant line. Justice moves slow, but it moves certain when good people refuse to let it stop moving at all. Clara kept that lecture along with William's 311 unsent ones, and the letter of proposal that had finally broken 6 years of silence for good, in the same cedar box that had once held only grief. It sat now on the mantel of the home she and William had built together, not hidden beneath a bed as a private sorrow, but displayed openly as a testament to every letter that ever went unanswered and mattered anyway, to every quiet woman the world once mistook for powerless, to every soldier who came home, changed but not broken, and to the particular stubborn kind of love that refuses against every reasonable expectation to stop believing in a man the whole world has already agreed to bury. Clara Whitmore Harrison had spent 6 years writing to a grave certain in her bones that hope was not the same thing as foolishness. She had been right. And on the porch of the home they built together in the golden light of 100 ordinary evenings that followed, William never once let her wonder again whether her letters had found their way home.